Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Marcus, and I've been working as a delivery driver in Portland, Oregon for about 2 years now. Most of the time, I stick to daytime shifts and early evenings, but weekends are when the real money comes in. I usually push through until around midnight to catch those late-night bonuses and surge pricing on the app I use. The extra cash really helps with my student loans. Never had any serious problems with deliveries until about 6 weeks ago, when I got assigned the strangest pickup I've ever encountered. It started at this little Vietnamese restaurant called Golden Lotus, not a chain, just a family-owned place tucked away in southeast Portland. I'd picked up from there maybe 4 or 5 times before, always getting the usual sealed bags with their logo. But this time was different. Instead of the typical order, an extremely nervous employee handed me a medium-sized cardboard box. His hands were actually shaking as he passed it over. "Don't open it," he whispered urgently, avoiding eye contact. "Just don't open it, okay?" Now, I know the rules, we never open packages anyway, but something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. What could possibly be inside? I wanted to ask what was going on, but before I could say anything, he practically sprinted back into the kitchen, leaving me standing there with this mysterious box in my hands. I'll admit, my first thought was that maybe it contained something illegal. But I delivered from Golden Lotus plenty of times before, and they seemed like decent people. Still, something about this whole situation felt wrong. Really wrong. I secured the box in my insulated delivery bag, strapped it to my back, and headed out on my motorcycle toward the delivery address. The destination was way out in the West Hills, almost an hour's ride through winding roads I'd never taken before. It was one of those warm September nights, and I had my music playing softly through my earbuds as I navigated the increasingly remote streets. About halfway there, I heard a car honking behind me. I glanced in my mirror and saw headlights flashing. First, I figured they just wanted to pass, so I slowed down and moved to the right. But the honking continued, getting more insistent. Finally, the driver pulled up beside me at a red light and rolled down his window. "Hey," he shouted over the traffic noise. "Your bag's open." My heart nearly stopped. I immediately pulled over into a gas station parking lot and checked my delivery bag. Sure enough, the zipper was completely undone, but thankfully the box was still there, nestled securely inside. How the hell had the zipper opened? I always double-check these things. I zipped it back up, making sure it was properly secured this time, and got back on the road. But about 10 minutes later, I felt something pressing against my back like someone poking me right between the shoulder blades. I adjusted the bag, thinking maybe the box had shifted and a sharp corner was digging into me. But then it happened again. And again. Each time it felt exactly like a finger tapping deliberately against my spine. I pulled over again, heart pounding, and opened the bag. The box was sitting there innocently, sealed with packing tape, completely silent and still. I sat there for a moment, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just the vibrations from the motorcycle. But as I was thinking this through, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint scratching sound coming from inside the box. The temptation to rip it open was overwhelming. Every instinct told me I needed to know what I was carrying. But I remembered the terrified look on that employee's face, and something deep down warned me that ignorance might be safer. I forced myself to zip up the bag, said a quick prayer, and got back on the bike. But things only got worse from there. The The tapping became more frequent, and I could swear I heard movement, not just scratching now, but something shifting around inside the box. Was I carrying some kind of animal? Then the weight started changing. If you've ever ridden a motorcycle with a passenger, you know how it affects the handling. Well, that's exactly what began happening. The bag on my back felt like it was getting heavier and heavier, until it felt like I had a full-grown person clinging to me. By the time I was fighting to keep control of the bike, I was in full panic mode. I pulled over on the shoulder of this dark mountain road, cars whizzing past me, and threw the bag onto the ground. I ripped it open with shaking hands. The box sat there, silent, motionless, just a plain cardboard box sealed with brown packing tape. I knew I was losing my mind, but I also knew I had to finish this delivery. I was already more than halfway there, and turning back wasn't going to solve anything. I strapped the bag back on and made myself a promise: deliver the package, collect my money, and get the hell out of there. No questions, no conversation, just a simple transaction. The rest of the ride was a nightmare. The weight on my back felt crushing, like carrying a bag full of concrete blocks. The tapping against my spine was constant now, and I could have sworn I felt breathing on the back of my neck. When I checked my mirrors, there was nothing there, but the sensation of someone sitting behind me never went away. Usually a pretty cautious rider, I've seen too many motorcycle accidents to take chances. But that night, I pushed my bike harder than I ever had before. I didn't start slowing down until I saw the delivery address ahead. The house wasn't actually in the main residential area I'd been expecting. Instead, the GPS had led me further up the mountain to a cluster of maybe 5 or 6 houses scattered along a dirt road. At the very top, I could see the silhouette of an old wooden cross against the starlit sky. The house itself was small and rundown, with peeling paint and a front yard overgrown with weeds. My phone confirmed this was the right address, but everything in me wanted to turn around and leave. Instead, I forced myself to walk to the front door. I knocked 3 times, hard enough to be heard but not aggressive. As I was setting down my bag to retrieve the box, the door swung open before I could even reach the zipper. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, probably in her 70s, with steel-gray hair and sharp, calculating eyes. She looked at me with obvious displeasure, then immediately focused on the box in my hands. Without a word, she snatched it away from me and stepped back into the house. That's when I made my mistake. I let curiosity get the better of me. As she turned to set the box down, I caught a glimpse of her living room. The floor was bare dirt, covered with strange symbols drawn in what looked like chalk or salt. Black candles were burning everywhere, and there was an altar set up against the far wall. I could see photographs with pins stuck through them, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and what looked like small animal bones arranged in patterns. My blood went ice cold. I was delivering to a witch, an actual practicing witch. I quickly looked away, but it was too late. Somehow she knew I'd seen inside. She turned back to me with a smile that was anything but friendly. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, her voice honey-sweet but with an undertone that made my skin crawl. "No, ma'am," I managed to stammer. "Company policy. I can't enter customers' homes." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Are you sure you wouldn't like to know what was in the box?" "No, thank you," I said as politely as I could manage. "That'll be $37.50 for the delivery." Her expression turned cold again. She reached into the pocket of her black dress and pulled out exact change, 3 tens, a 5, and 2 ones and 50 cents in quarters. She counted it out slowly, deliberately, never taking her eyes off me. Then she slammed the door in my face. I practically ran back to my motorcycle, but when I tried to start it, nothing happened. I kicked the starter again and again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. My bike had never failed me before. I just had it serviced the week prior. From the corner of my eye, I could see the old woman watching me from her window. I kept trying to start the bike, growing more desperate with each failed attempt. It wasn't until she finally moved away from the window that the engine suddenly roared to life. Don't know what kind of power that woman had, and I don't want to know. But she could have kept me there if she'd wanted to. For whatever reason, she chose to let me go. I've never ridden so fast in my life. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that house. I was so rattled that I nearly crashed at the bottom of the hill, where the mountain road met the main street. I had to pull over to collect myself, and that's when I noticed an old man sitting on a bench at a bus stop. He must have seen how shaken I was, because he called out to me, "You okay, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." I was so desperate for human contact, for some kind of normalcy, that I found myself telling him everything. The whole story just poured out of me: the strange pickup, the mysterious box, the sensations during the ride, and the witch's house. The old man listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he said, "That woman's been up there for as long as I can remember. Most folks in town know to stay away from her. But it sounds like she got what she wanted and sent you on your way. That's what matters." I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. Someone believed me. Someone understood. As I was getting ready to leave, I couldn't help but ask, "Do you have any idea what was in that box?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Then he asked, "Did you open it? Any of those times you stopped to check?" "No," I said. "I never opened it." He nodded approvingly. "Good. Keep it that way. Some things are better left unknown." I knew immediately that he understood more about what I'd experienced than he was letting on, but something in his tone told me not to push for details. I thanked him and rode home. To this day, I have no idea what I carried on my back for nearly 2 hours that night. I also don't know what connection a Vietnamese restaurant could possibly have with a witch living an hour away in the mountains. But just to be safe, whenever I see a pickup from Golden Lotus come through after dark, I let someone else take it. I never want to see that woman again. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is David, and I've been working as a delivery driver in Phoenix, Arizona for about 8 months now. I've got to say, this job exposes you to some pretty weird experiences, especially during the night shift. You get your share of suspicious customers, people who ask for strange things, or folks who just act downright threatening. I've talked to other drivers, and they all say I've had more than my fair share of bad luck. I guess I have to agree with them. But what happened to me 3 weeks ago was something else entirely. It wasn't just strange customers or sketchy neighborhoods. This was something I still can't fully explain. Look, I don't really believe in paranormal stuff. I mean, I enjoy a good horror story as much as the next person, but I've always been pretty skeptical about ghosts and all that. Still, I can't find any logical explanation for what I experienced that night. It was a Friday evening, and I was having one of those busy nights where the orders just kept coming. People always seem to order more takeout on weekends, and I work for one of those apps that delivers from all different restaurants around the city. I accepted a delivery to a neighborhood called Desert Vista. It was pretty far out, almost to the edge of the city limits, but the payout was good because of the distance. I'm still relatively new to Phoenix, so I wasn't familiar with that part of town. I wish I had been. The drive started out normal enough, but as I got further from the city center, the roads got progressively worse. The streetlights became more sparse, then disappeared altogether. I found myself driving very slowly through a maze of potholes, using my headlights to navigate what was essentially a poorly maintained dirt road. This was exactly the kind of place where carjackers like to operate, isolated, dark, with plenty of escape routes through the desert. I kept checking my mirrors and scanning the roadside for any signs of trouble. The silence out there was complete, except for the sound of my engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under my tires. After about 20 minutes of this, I finally started seeing lights in the distance. The neighborhood, when I reached it, was a collection of small, weathered houses scattered across the desert landscape. Most of them looked like they'd been built decades ago and hadn't seen much maintenance since. I found the address easily enough. It was a modest, single-story house with a small front yard full of cacti and desert plants. What struck me immediately was that all the lights were off inside. I double-checked the address on my phone. This was definitely the right place. I grabbed the 2 bags of food from my passenger seat and walked up to the front door. Before I could even knock, the door opened, and I found myself face to face with a teenage girl, maybe 15 or 16 years old. She was wearing a white sundress and had a bright smile that seemed almost too cheerful for the late hour. She had dark skin and the most piercing blue eyes I'd ever seen. Her hair was messy, like she'd just woken up, but her teeth were perfectly white, and that smile never left her face. What bothered me was the way she immediately looked past me toward my car, and her smile seemed to take on a different quality, like she was enjoying some private joke. "Did you come alone?" she asked in a whisper that sent chills down my spine. I didn't know how to respond to that. The question caught me completely off guard, and I felt that familiar tingle of unease. She quickly took both bags from my hands and handed me a $50 bill. I was about to give her change when she said, "Keep it. Thanks for bringing dinner." $15 tip from a teenager. That was unusually generous, but I wasn't about to argue. Still, her question kept echoing in my head. Did you come alone? Why would she ask that? And why did she seem so pleased about something? She stepped back into the house and closed the door, still wearing that mysterious smile. "Drive safe," she called through the door, but I could hear the laughter in her voice. I walked back to my car feeling confused but happy about the generous tip. As I approached the driver's side, I thought I saw something move in the back seat, just a quick flash of movement in my peripheral vision. I'd locked the doors when I got out, but you never know. I opened the door and immediately turned on the interior light, checking the back seat thoroughly. Nothing. No one hiding under the seats, no one crouched behind the front seats. Just empty space and my delivery bag. I was definitely alone. I started the car and began driving back down that same poorly lit road toward the main highway. I'd only been driving for about 5 minutes when I heard it, a soft giggle that seemed to come from right inside the car with me. It was definitely a child's laugh, but it wasn't distant or muffled like it would be if it came from one of the houses I was passing. This sounded like it was coming from my back seat. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe audio from a house I was passing, but deep down I knew that wasn't possible. There were no houses nearby, and I had my windows rolled up. I kept driving, trying to focus on avoiding the potholes, when I heard it again. This time a full laugh, definitely from a child, and definitely inside my car. I hit the gas harder, not caring any more about the rough road or my suspension. I just wanted to get back to civilization. But then something happened that made my blood run cold. I started feeling like there was extra weight in my car, like when you're carrying passengers. The car's handling changed subtly, the way it does when you have people in the back seat. I could feel eyes on me. Even though I couldn't see anything in the mirrors, I could sense movement behind me, like someone shifting around in the seat. The child's laughter came again, but this time it was closer, like whoever was laughing was leaning forward toward me. Then, out of nowhere, I had this overwhelming urge to look in the rearview mirror. It was like something was commanding me to look, and every fiber of my being was fighting against it. I knew that if I looked and saw something, I might lose control of the car completely. I tried to keep my eyes fixed on the road ahead, but I could feel the presence behind me getting stronger. More laughter, this time from what sounded like multiple children. The weight in the car seemed to increase, and I could swear I felt someone's breath on the back of my neck. Finally, I hit a particularly deep pothole, and the jolt made me instinctively glance up at the rearview mirror. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. 2 children, maybe 8 or 9 years old, were sitting in my back seat. They were both pale, with dark hair and eyes that seemed too old for their faces. They were smiling at me, but their smiles were wrong, somehow too wide, too knowing. And they were laughing, pointing at me like I was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. I screamed, I don't know how loud, because everything went silent for a moment. I slammed on the brakes and threw the car into park right there in the middle of the road. I jumped out and ran around to the back door, yanking it open. The back seat was empty. I stood there in the middle of nowhere, shaking, staring at the empty interior of my car. I grabbed my phone and called my brother Jake. He's also a delivery driver, so he was still working, but I was crying so hard I could barely explain what had happened. Jake and I are really close, and even though he didn't understand what I was talking about, he could tell I was in serious trouble. He dropped everything and came to find me, following my GPS location. When he arrived, he convinced me to get back in my car and follow him back to town. The laughter had stopped, but I could still feel that presence in the back seat, like someone was sitting there, watching me. That feeling didn't go away until we reached the main highway, and I could see the city lights ahead. It was honestly one of the worst experiences of my life. I haven't accepted any deliveries to that area since, and even though I kept working that night, I couldn't get it out of my head for days afterward. The next morning, I spent hours going over my car with a fine-tooth comb. I checked for hidden speakers, cameras, phones, anything someone could have planted to create those sounds. I found nothing. And even if someone had somehow rigged my car to play children's laughter, how would that explain what I saw in the mirror? I'm still pretty skeptical about ghosts and supernatural stuff. Maybe I'm just stubborn, or maybe part of me doesn't want to accept what I experienced. But I am absolutely certain about one thing. That teenage girl who took the food knew exactly what was going to happen to me. I don't know if she could see the children in my car when I arrived, or if she somehow knew about them already. My sister-in-law suggested that maybe the girl was responsible for the whole thing, that she had some way of making it happen. I have no idea how that would be possible. But if there's even a small chance she was behind it, I definitely don't want to find out how she did it. All I know is that somewhere out there in the desert, there are two children who like to hitch rides with unsuspecting drivers. And there's a teenage girl who seems to know all about them. My name is Carlos, and I've been working as a delivery driver in New Mexico for several years now. Due to the situation in my area a few years back, with drug cartels controlling large parts of the state, I can honestly say my job was extremely high risk for a long time. The cartels had claimed every corner of certain regions, and in my line of work, I encountered a lot of criminal activity and dangerous situations. But people still needed to live their lives. They still ordered things online, and someone had to deliver packages to their homes and businesses. Because of this, I witnessed many disturbing things over the years. However, what I experienced just 8 months ago was one of the strangest and most terrifying encounters of my career, and also the most unexplainable. With the cartels mostly driven out of our area, the roads are safer now. Currently, I work for a shipping company that delivers clothes, shoes, and beauty products throughout the region. Our warehouse is located on the outskirts of Albuquerque, and we service almost the entire northern part of the state. One afternoon, near the end of my shift, my supervisor asked me to take some packages to a group of stores in a small town about an hour and a half away. I was tired and ready to go home, but he offered me a distance bonus that I really needed. Money's been tight, so I agreed. I loaded up the company van with the packages I needed to deliver and hit the road with my GPS, showing me the route. As I mentioned, the highways are much safer now, and while I still maintain the habit of staying alert and checking my surroundings, I allow myself to listen to music and podcasts to make the drive more enjoyable. That particular day, I had put on a horror podcast to keep me company as darkness began to fall around me. The road was empty, and I felt like the spooky atmosphere of the show matched the desolate landscape perfectly. Maybe it was just the power of suggestion, but I started feeling unusually uneasy. My ears felt hot, and a strange cold sensation began creeping up my legs. I suppose all of that was just a preview of what was about to happen. About 45 minutes into the drive, I noticed my GPS acting up. The arrow started spinning erratically, and although I didn't know this particular route very well, I was pretty sure I needed to stay on the main highway for at least another 30 minutes to reach my destination. I didn't pay much attention to the GPS malfunction and kept driving as night fell completely around me. A thick fog began to envelop the van, making visibility difficult. I turned on my headlights and watched the temperature drop noticeably. Light rain started hitting my windshield, and I felt frustrated that I hadn't just told my supervisor no. I could have been home by now. The GPS arrow suddenly began spinning wildly, and then the entire map went blank, as if no roads existed at all. This made me genuinely nervous, but I assumed it was because of the weather. I took a deep breath and continued forward, or at least tried to. A few hundred yards ahead, I discovered that the highway was completely blocked off with orange traffic cones and police tape. I put my head in my hands, knowing that if the road was closed, I'd have to find an alternate route through unfamiliar territory. I noticed a police officer standing motionless next to the roadblock, staring off into the distance. He looked young but strangely disheveled, standing completely still in the rain as if it didn't affect him at all. I didn't really want to get out of the van, but I needed to know what had happened and how to get around the closure. I pulled on my jacket and stepped out into the drizzle, waving at him from a distance. "Evening, officer," I called out. "What's the situation with the road closure?" He turned toward me very slowly, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. His expression was completely blank, empty, almost lifeless. He raised one trembling finger and pointed toward a side road that led into what looked like a small town. While speaking in the weakest voice I'd ever heard, like he was struggling to breathe. "Accident," he whispered. "Take the detour through town." It's hard to put into words, but at that moment I felt surrounded, as if I was standing in the middle of a crowd. It was like there were other people around me, complaining about the road being blocked, even though I could see we were alone. I shook myself hard because he wouldn't stop staring at me, and it was making me incredibly uncomfortable. I thanked him as politely as I could and slowly backed toward my van, maintaining eye contact the entire time. As I reached the driver's door, he turned back to face the road and whispered something I barely caught. "Be careful." I started driving again in that light drizzle that wouldn't stop, and the first thing I noticed as I entered the town and began driving down a narrow asphalt street was that there wasn't a single streetlight working. Combined with the fog and rain, I could barely see the road ahead of me. I began to regret my decision to accept this job, convinced it was my fault for saying yes to my supervisor. My legs were freezing, and my hands were cramped around the steering wheel. Gradually, I started noticing shadows moving around my van out of the corner of my eye, like people walking alongside me. I was driving very slowly to avoid any accidents. I didn't want some kid to run out of a house and not give me time to brake. I felt nervous and anxious because something inside me said this place wasn't normal. Not a single light was on inside any of the houses, which seemed impossible. But just as I thought that, I saw a light turn on in a house up ahead, revealing the silhouette of someone, a woman, I think, based on the long hair. I stared at the figure, but with the backlighting and all that fog, it was impossible to make out any features. I drove past, but the same thing happened a couple more times with other houses and other people. They were watching me, like I didn't belong there, like I shouldn't be in that place. People appeared from behind dark utility poles like shadows, and I didn't know what to think. While I didn't immediately assume it was something supernatural, I knew I wasn't in a safe place. Suddenly, I felt a hard impact against the back of the van. I tried to see in my side mirror, but there was no one there. I turned around and flicked on the interior light, but in the van, there were only the packages I was supposed to deliver and me. I started hyperventilating and slowly accelerated while winding through those unfamiliar streets, desperately hoping my GPS would start working again. I kept looking at the device, frantically pressing buttons while I began to hear whispers outside the van. I listened carefully, but I couldn't understand anything except that they sounded like laments or complaints. By this time, the rain had stopped, but I kept my windows up and doors locked. That thin glass was my only defense, pretty poor protection against anyone who wanted to block my path. It was like traveling back in time to that horrible era when death lurked on every road. Suddenly, when I looked up, I saw what I had successfully avoided so many times in the past. My heart sank when 3 heavily tattooed men appeared in front of the van. Slammed on the brakes, screaming inside the vehicle as they stared back at me with furious expressions. I raised my hands, thinking they were going to hurt me, but they just stood there watching me. Eventually, 2 of them stepped aside, clearing the path. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the fog. The one in the middle raised his finger and pointed down a street that descended to the left. Then he backed away until my headlights no longer illuminated him, melting into the darkness of the night. I spent several minutes trying to decide what to do, crying in my seat because I didn't know if this was a trap or not. The whispers continued around me, and I felt more impacts against the back of the van that pushed me to hit the accelerator and turn left as directed. Up until that point, everything had been very tense, and my heart was in my throat, waiting for it all to end. I could see the main highway below, illuminated by street lamps, and I felt like everything was about to be over. But the spirits that had trapped me in their town had one last thing to say. Suddenly, I heard terrible screams and a burst of gunfire, shot after shot, echoing through the night. I floored the accelerator and merged onto the highway without even slowing down, because I felt like a bullet had hit the van's body. Thank God I didn't flip the vehicle, but there was no way I could calm down until I'd put 2 or 3 miles between myself and that place, and my GPS started working again. I looked carefully at the small map screen, and there was no town marked anywhere in that area. I had no peace for the rest of the trip. The entire journey, I kept remembering what I'd seen, trying to understand what I had witnessed. I recalled details that I had overlooked in the moment, ignored due to the stress of the situation. Like how the dirt on the police officer's uniform appeared red under my van's headlights. Or how those gang members had what I initially thought were tattoos, but in retrospect were obviously bullet wounds. Later, I examined the van's body inch by inch, but the famous bullet impact I'd felt echoing throughout the cargo area didn't exist. It took me weeks to accept that what I'd experienced was something paranormal. When I drove that same route again later, there was no roadblock or accident, and from the other side of the highway, I could see the road that led into the town, now deteriorated and abandoned. Today I know I was in a ghost town, though I can't explain how such a thing was possible. The truth is, I couldn't find any information about that mysterious ghost town. No one knew about any lost settlement on that route. Only one person had any information, a secretary in my company's administrative department. She told me that a small group of people had moved to that area many years ago, building very basic houses made of sheet metal and cardboard. But she didn't know what happened to them either. There are no records, no old news reports, no evidence, no police reports from the cartel era, nothing. Only God knows what happened in that place. I just pray that nothing like that ever happens to me again. My name is Max, and I'm a medical student about to finish my degree. But a few years ago, when I was just starting my university studies, I worked part-time as a delivery driver for a pizza place. I did it during the afternoons and evenings since I attended classes in the mornings. I lasted about 4 months in that job, where my work was delivering pizzas to addresses using the motorcycle they assigned me. But let me tell you what made me quit in such a short time. Back then, I was a young man of only 19 years old. I still remember that night. It was almost 10 p.m. when I received the order to deliver the last order of the day. It was in a neighborhood somewhat far from the restaurant. I knew I'd get home very late, so I hurried to get there as quickly as possible so I could do my college assignments. I arrived at the address, and honestly, the house was very beautiful. In the front garden, there were many plants and beautiful flowers. Although it was somewhat dark, I could still see them thanks to the streetlights. I rang the doorbell, and a male voice responded from inside, telling me to come in, that the door wasn't locked. I entered the patio and waited for the man to come out for his pizza and pay me. I was standing behind the main door, assuming the man wouldn't take long to come out since he'd acknowledged that I'd arrived with his order. But several minutes passed, and no one came out. In fact, there was quite an uncomfortable silence for me, since there was no one on the street anymore. And the house was very quiet too. I was getting impatient because, as I mentioned, I was in a bit of a hurry to get home. So I knocked on the door 3 times while telling him loudly that his pizza had arrived, but no one came out. That's when I felt something touch my ankle. I got scared and jumped backward, and when I looked down to see what had touched me, I saw a hand coming out through the small pet door. And on top of it was the money for the pizza. But what made me drop the pizza and then run away was that the hand was very swollen and very white. It was the hand of a deceased person. I knew it immediately because I was studying medicine. I knew exactly what a lifeless body looked like. I got on the motorcycle and drove to the restaurant as fast as I could. I was very scared, and my heart wouldn't stop beating rapidly. I felt a lot of adrenaline in that moment. When I got there, I told the manager what had happened to me, and he immediately called the police to inform them. It turned out that when the officers searched that address, inside they found a scene of terror. Lying in the entrance was the body of an elderly woman, lifeless, and a few meters from her, they also found a cat without life. It was the lady's pet. They also found the empty pizza box on top of the table, but there was no trace of the killer. He left no fingerprints. That woman lived alone with her pet. Her story came out in the media, and the neighbors said she was a very lonely woman. She had no children, and no one ever went to visit her. And honestly, I felt a lot of pity for her, for how she ended up. But what terrified me most was that sick criminal and his twisted mind, because I'm sure he enjoyed scaring me by putting the money in that lifeless woman's hand and sticking it out through the pet door. I don't know what kind of psychopath you have to be to do something like that, and I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed longer. Maybe I would have been one of his victims too. After that, I couldn't continue in that job. I quit and got another one shortly after. But that night, without a doubt, I'll never forget. I carry it with me every day of my life. My name is Edgar. I'm 35 years old now. But today, I want to tell you about an experience that happened to me when I was 23 and working as a delivery driver for a pizza restaurant here in San Diego. That pizzeria stayed open until 1 a.m. because it was close to the bar and nightclub area of the city. And they took advantage of the fact that many young people would go eat there after partying. I didn't have a problem with that. I liked driving the motorcycle through the early morning hours when everything was calmer outside that zone, obviously. And although there were few orders at those late night hours, that's where this macabre experience begins. One night, it was exactly 12 midnight when a call came in. I was at the counter chatting with my coworker who handled the cash register and took orders. He answered the call and told me I had work. The pizza came out almost immediately, and I left to deliver it. I drove for about 15 minutes until I reached that house. But when I arrived, I thought I had the wrong address because the house looked very neglected and dark, as if it were abandoned. I double-checked the number I had written down, and indeed, that was the house, but it didn't look like anyone was living there. I got off the motorcycle and took the pizza. I remember there was a long, dark driveway, but it had no gate. You could walk right into the back where the main door was. But honestly, it gave me some fear to do so because the place was quite dark. I walked a few steps toward the inside without going all the way to the back of the driveway and shouted that the pizza had arrived. That's when a male voice responded from inside the house, simply shouting for me to come in. I stood there for a few seconds observing the surroundings. Well, it didn't give me confidence to go all the way to the back, but then he shouted again for me to come in, but this time louder and with a deeper voice. I was just about to start walking when I heard a lady talking to me from the sidewalk. It was a woman who had many street dogs with her. She looked somewhat unkempt, like she might be homeless, but she seemed to be very aware because when I came out to see what she wanted, the first thing she told me was not to enter that house. I told her they had ordered a pizza and I had to go deliver it, but she responded that no one lived in that house. It's worth mentioning that her dogs started barking at the house, and some of them moved away as if they were afraid. Meanwhile, the woman told me that house was uninhabited, that a year ago the owner had died, a 60-year-old man who lived alone but who liked young men a lot, since they always saw him bringing a different one to his house. But some time later, he died. Honestly, I was stunned. Although at this point, I didn't know if the woman was mentally sound. I swear she spoke with great seriousness, and I believed everything she told me because her dogs wouldn't stop barking at that house. And she herself told me that her little dogs didn't like to pass by there because they got very nervous. I told her that someone had answered me from inside. I asked if it wasn't inhabited by a new owner, but she told me to observe the house carefully and the conditions it was in. The driveway was full of garbage and smelled like fecal matter. And then she asked me, ironically, if I thought someone was going to live in that place. I just stared at her because I didn't know what to do. She told me that for my own good, I should better leave because there was no one inside there, at least no one alive. After that, she left with her dogs, and I decided to leave too. I arrived at the restaurant with the pizza. My coworker asked me why I hadn't delivered it, and I told him what had happened to me. He said I did well not to enter, that the situation was very strange. Although he was skeptical that there was a ghost there, he had the idea that maybe it was someone who wanted to hurt me. But anyway, we left it at that night. That same week, a day after my day off, when I showed up to work, my coworker at the register was the first to tell me that the day before, they had called again from that house, and another delivery driver had gone to make the delivery. The manager was at the location, and despite my coworker telling him what had happened to me on that occasion, he forced the delivery driver to go. Of course, he told him not to enter, to wait for the person to come out for their order. The guy had to go, and he returned pale with fear. He told us he went all the way to the back where the main door was located. He knocked several times, but no one opened until he heard a man's voice telling him to come in. Of course, the guy didn't enter, but he did stay standing behind the door. He says the door suddenly opened, but it was very dark, and he couldn't see anything inside. But within seconds, he felt something pulling him inside. But he says it wasn't a person because he didn't see any silhouette of anyone who was there. He didn't know what it was, but he managed to run away from the place and returned to the restaurant almost speechless. The manager made a report to the police explaining what had happened. 2 officers had gone that same night, but obviously the house was abandoned. There was no one inside, not even furniture. It was just a simple abandoned house. I felt so much terror hearing that because I don't know what would have happened if the lady hadn't warned me about what was happening in that place, and I had entered through that door. After that, my coworker received calls from that house very often, but always at 12 midnight. He says it was a man's voice ordering a pizza to the same address and then hanging up. Of course, no one went to make the delivery anymore. We simply ignored it. And it went on like that for several weeks until it finally stopped. We don't know why he called that restaurant, or if he also called other restaurants. We also didn't know where he was calling from because in that house there was nothing, not even a telephone. Although the calls came from that address, since that number was registered to that address. It was something very terrifying that at the time took me a long time to assimilate, to be able to believe that I had lived through it, since nothing paranormal had ever happened to me in my work or anywhere else. But it happened to me. Never trust anyone, that's all I can tell you. The Animal Mask Cult. My name is Gilbert, and I hope you're doing well. I want to share my story with you, which although it happened some time ago, still terrifies me to remember that strange and sinister night. I'm from Chicago, and back then I worked for a Chinese food restaurant as a delivery driver. My shift ended around 11 p.m. since the restaurant closed at midnight, but orders were accepted for delivery until 11. On one of those nights, I had to go deliver an order to a new subdivision on the outskirts of the city where I'd never been before. There were still very few inhabited houses. All the others were under construction, and there were also many empty lots between the houses. That was the first thing I noticed when I entered that subdivision, because it was very lonely. There were even entire blocks I passed through that were completely abandoned, with only gray construction sites and the occasional empty lot. Finally, I found the street where the order's house was located, but I found it strange that the further I went, the more I saw only unfinished houses. I couldn't see any inhabited houses yet. I traveled that entire long block and reached the house number I'd been given. It was a house that was almost finished. It already had doors and windows on the first floor, but it was missing the second floor windows and wasn't painted yet. You could see it was a house that was barely under construction. That's why I found it strange that someone had ordered food to that location. And that's when I started thinking it might have been a prank, since it had happened to us before that they'd send us to addresses, and it turned out the owners said they hadn't ordered anything. So that went through my head at that moment, seeing that house in those conditions. I didn't even bother to get off my bike. I started the motorcycle again to leave. But then I saw someone open the door of that house. I was surprised when I saw a man come out wearing a dog mask. I found it very strange since we weren't even close to Halloween. In fact, it was summer. So it didn't give me a good feeling. The man waved at me and then told me that he was the one who had ordered the food, which, by the way, was a lot. It was 4 plates full to the brim with Chinese food. I got off the motorcycle and walked toward where the guy was to deliver the order to him. But then the man told me to wait at the door, that he'd go get his wallet. But suddenly I saw someone else open the door. It was another guy wearing a pig mask. And in the background I saw a table full of people, all wearing masks of different animals, very disturbing ones, by the way. In the middle of the table, they had candles since the house still didn't have electricity. I swear seeing that gave me goosebumps. I started taking small steps backward because my whole body, my instinct, was warning me that something wasn't right and that I had to get out of there as soon as possible. But while I was backing away, the man with the pig mask was inviting me to come in and asking me very seriously why I was afraid of them. I couldn't answer anything. Fear wouldn't let me speak. Meanwhile, everyone at the table was laughing at me. They were mocking me. Suddenly, I heard laughter coming from the second floor of the house. It was the man with the dog mask who had come out at first. He was watching me from a second-floor window while mocking me. I threw the food plates however I could, got on the motorcycle, but while I was trying to leave, I noticed they were chasing me, mocking me. They couldn't catch me because I accelerated as much as I could, and when I managed to get out of that subdivision, I called the restaurant to report what had happened. But they didn't do anything. They didn't call the police until the next day after I put pressure on them. But the police found nothing. They only reported that house was still not finished and much less inhabited, that there were no traces that anyone had been there, and there wasn't even a table like I had mentioned. I didn't know what happened to those people or what they were doing in that place, but I know it wasn't anything good. And I know I wouldn't be here telling you this if they had caught me. It was a very sinister scene. They really seemed like they were all crazy, and the masks made everything even more disturbing. Today, I no longer live in that city. I don't know if that house is now inhabited, although I imagine it is, since this was several years ago. The only thing I know is that they left me with trauma that I'm still working on in therapy, and it helps me to share my story with people. It helps me not feel alone in that aspect and to vent about that horrible experience. A home delivery made me realize that in the world there exist many mysteries that man still hasn't discovered, or that he discovered and found a way to keep them secret. Whatever the reason, until today I hadn't dared to tell anyone anything for fear that they might think I was going crazy or losing my mind. I'm from Dallas, Texas, and it happened when I worked as a delivery driver at a fast food restaurant. I got along well with everyone, especially with my female manager, who gave me a good part of the tips at the end of the day, and with whom I had intimate relations in secret, without anyone finding out. Sometimes we were the last ones to stay at the restaurant, and we'd do it in the kitchen. Other times we'd leave early, and she'd use the excuse that she was going to give me a ride just because it was on her way and she liked to drive. I never knew if any coworkers figured it out and didn't say anything out of fear of being fired, but I didn't care. She was very pretty and had a good body. She made my nights brighter just by seeing her and the flirtatious way she talked to me. Despite all that, one night put an end not only to that secret romance, but to my work at that restaurant. They had assigned me an order like any other. They gave me a paper with the address and the name of the person who ordered it. The thing is, on the way to that place, I received a call from a man who claimed to know me and told me he was going to give me a large amount of money if I didn't deliver the food I was carrying in my bag where I was supposed to, but where he told me so he could eat it. I told him he could easily help him by making a call to the restaurant so they could prepare something new and deliver it to him in the shortest possible time. But he insisted that no, saying it would be faster if it was the one I was carrying. And then he mentioned the money again. That convinced me, and I told him yes. Then he gave me the address, and I changed my route, heading to where he told me. I planned to give part of it to my manager so I wouldn't have problems, but that would be later. I don't know why, but I remember that when I was arriving, I started to feel strange. I felt a bad premonition, and on more than 2 occasions, I almost lost my balance on the motorcycle and fell. I was lucky the streets were empty at that hour, or I would have had a serious accident. I arrived at where that man told me, but it was a parking lot. At first, I didn't see anyone. I tried to call him, and then I heard the phone ringing. I followed the sound, walking slowly. From the way it seemed to be hidden, the only thing that went through my mind was that maybe the person who called me was having intimate relations behind some car or inside one. But it wasn't like that. I looked and peered between two trucks, and then I saw the scene that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A lifeless body was on the ground with the cell phone ringing beside it. But on top of it was a man, apparently a man, but with black fur all over his body, and with an abnormal length of his torso, behaving like an animal and covered in blood from that poor man he had just killed. I was frozen, and without realizing it, I let out a muffled sigh that thing managed to hear. That man lifted his head and looked at me with those wild but lifeless eyes, as if he felt no emotions. He didn't seem like a man in disguise. He was something more. That kind of Nahul, chupacabra, or some creature from the legends told in the villages. Regaining control of my body, I backed away slowly, trying not to make noise even though he had already seen me. That thing growled, but didn't move from its position over the inert body. I turned around and headed toward my motorcycle, trying not to panic. The engine started, and I immediately accelerated, getting away from that parking lot with my heart beating 1,000 times per hour. While I headed back to the restaurant, I tried to calm down and think about what I should do. I couldn't go back there as if nothing had happened. I had to tell someone, but who? The police, my manager, who would believe me? I decided the best thing was to talk to my manager. She had always been understanding with me, and maybe she could help me find a solution. When I got to the restaurant, she was already closing. Her expression turned to concern when she saw me so altered. I told her everything, from the call from the man, whom I deduced had been that thing that spoke at that moment, to the creature in the parking lot. Her eyes widened with each word, but she didn't interrupt me. We went together to the police station and related the story. The officers seemed skeptical, but the seriousness of our voice and the coherence in the details convinced them that they should at least investigate. The next day, the local news talked about a murder in a parking lot, but they didn't mention anything about the creature I saw. I wondered if the authorities decided to keep that part secret to avoid panic, or maybe there was something I didn't understand. During the following days, I felt watched, as if someone was monitoring me. Weeks passed, and my life seemed to return to normal. I had taken a few days off, but returned to work at the same restaurant, trying to forget what happened. One night while I was closing the restaurant, my manager approached me, but not in the way she used to, but as if she wanted to tell me something. And indeed, this is what she told me. The creature you saw isn't the only one. There are more of them. My uncle belongs to a secret society that hides among us. They are sorcerers, or as many know them, shapeshifters. Some can be peaceful, but there are others like the one you saw that can be very dangerous. You can't say anything about what you saw because you could be in great danger by wanting to make your sighting public. I was stunned, unable to process what she was telling me. I didn't know what to do or say. I was left speechless and only told her I had to go. The next day, I received a message from her telling me not to show up to work anymore, that it was for the best, and I never heard from her again. Since that day, I live with the certainty that the world is much more mysterious and dangerous than I ever imagined. Maybe no one will believe my experience, but I know what I saw. This happened in 2004. I remember when I started studying at the university, I was running a bit short on money for everything that was required of me, not to mention transportation costs and the times I had to eat there. So I decided to start working as a food delivery driver for a restaurant on the north side of Miami. My name is Leo, and from Florida I share my story with you. The truth is, I was doing well at that job. The salary was modest, but my boss knew my situation and helped me with something extra. However, a special delivery, different and unique, made me experience what I consider today one of the most horrific experiences I would never like to repeat. It was a normal night. I had just arrived since I had to take midterm exams. I had spent the whole week studying, and I felt nervous because all my classmates kept saying that professor was one of the worst, who could easily make us fail the subject if he felt like it. I have to confess that I felt I prepared more than enough and answered the questions with great confidence. That motivated me at work, and my boss noticed it. That night I was supposed to make about 4 deliveries, when then he told me to stop making shipments. In fact, he proposed that I take a break because soon a special delivery would come out that he was saving just for me. I asked him for details about it, but he refused to tell me. The only thing that went through my mind was a good tip, and that's what I could expect if it was as special as he told me. Finally, the moment arrived. He called me on the phone and told me to come to the parking lot at the back with the restaurant bag where I put the food I would deliver. I did so, and I saw him with a bag where the order was. He handed it to me, gave me the address, and told me to be very careful not to do anything out of the ordinary, and to limit myself to making the delivery to return as quickly as possible. Before leaving, he told me that what I was going to see, I couldn't mention to anyone for any reason, and that when I left the house, the best thing was to forget it and not even tell him about it. Everything was strange, but when he told me how much they were going to give me as a tip, things changed. It was very good money, and I wasn't going to refuse it, not even as a joke. So I prepared the order in the bag and headed to the address my boss gave me. I couldn't stop thinking that this delivery was very different from all the ones I had made since I started working with him. There was something strange about everything, but I decided not to rack my brain thinking about it. Finally, I arrived at the house and got a big surprise. It was curiously very far from the others, withdrawn. The lights were off, giving the impression that there was no one inside. However, the house numbers were the same ones written on the paper my boss gave me, so it had to be there. I got off the motorcycle and went up the steps that led to the door. It looked like a ruined, abandoned dwelling. It felt a bit murky being there, but that was my job. I knocked on the door once, and no one came out. But on the second knock, it opened by itself. And from inside, I heard a voice telling me to come in and put the order on the table, that the money and the good tip I was promised were right there. I had no complaints about that, especially when I realized it was a woman's voice. It's just that the place smelled very bad, but with that payment, it was what mattered least to me. The lights from outside allowed me to see the table, but when I entered the house, some candles lit up that gave me a clearer view of the place. I concentrated so much on the table that I didn't turn to look elsewhere. I put the food there and grabbed the money without even counting it because it was a lot. But I separated what I had to return to my boss from the tip. Immediately when I turned my gaze to the rest of the room, I was shocked by what I saw. I didn't know whether to call her a woman or a deformity. Her skin was excessively full of wrinkles, few strands of hair between her skull and coming out of her armpits. She was completely naked, and her posture was very hunched. She walked without needing a cane, although it seemed like she needed one. But there was something even worse. Next to her was an altar full of human and animal parts. Some were just bones, and others were already rotting with a disgusting smell. I was paralyzed, unable to speak, trembling, and with my mind blank. I didn't make a single sound. It was that thing that spoke and smiled, apparently happy that she already had the package, and with a coldness, she simply told me to leave. Seeing so many human parts made me think that if she was capable of accumulating so many bodies there, then I could also end up there if I did something that disturbed her. So the best thing was to leave while I still had the chance. I did so, and when I got far enough away, I took out my phone to call the police. I told them everything I knew, and they told me not to move from there, that a patrol would arrive soon. I waited. I don't know how long. It could have been very little, but for me it was eternal, until on the corner I saw a car approaching. But I got a big surprise when, as it approached, I saw it was my boss. He quickly got out of the car and grabbed my phone, telling me never to make that mistake again, to forget what I saw and return to the restaurant, acting as if nothing had happened. He said I pleased him, but I could have a very bad time if I said anything. I didn't understand what had just happened. Apparently, the police were involved in this situation, but I didn't want to get more involved in the matter. I deduced that if I kept investigating, I was going to have a bad time, so I had no other choice. I arrived at the restaurant, and after half an hour my boss arrived, and we acted as if nothing happened. The only thing I can deduce is that my boss asked that witch for jobs to ensure the success of his restaurant, just like the police, who only they will know why they were involved in this macabre situation. Maybe they also asked for protection or something darker. 2 weeks later, I quit. My name is Joel, and I've been working as a delivery driver for years. You get used to the difficult neighborhoods, the uncomfortable hours, and the strange customers. You learn to put fear aside, but there was one night a couple of months ago that I still have trouble understanding. It was an experience that left me with a discomfort. I haven't been able to shake off something that now reminds me that sometimes you don't have all the answers. It was my last delivery of the night, past midnight, and I was ready to go home. But then an unexpected order came in. Leave it, it's late, I thought, but for some reason I accepted it. The address was in a neighborhood I didn't know very well. It was a somewhat remote area off the common routes, an apartment building on a street I rarely passed. When I arrived, the first impression made me uncomfortable. It was one of those old buildings, as if no one bothered to take care of the place anymore. Everything was dark except for a single yellow light at the entrance that flickered slightly. The first thing I did was send a message to the customer to confirm the apartment number. He responded almost immediately. Leave it at the building entrance and let me know when you're done. I didn't think much about it. It was something some customers asked for, especially if they didn't want direct contact. I got off the motorcycle, took the food bag, and walked toward the entrance, which was strangely quiet, not a single sound. Just when I was about to leave the order, I received another message. not at the entrance. Leave it on the fourth floor at the end of the hallway. I didn't feel like going up, especially without an elevator. But something made me accept. I supposed it would be someone elderly or with some difficulty. I started climbing floor by floor, and as I advanced, the silence became increasingly heavy. It was strange because old buildings always have noises, the creaking of wood, some old pipe, sounds from other apartments. But there, nothing. Each floor seemed more lonely than the previous one. When I reached the fourth floor, a long, poorly lit hallway greeted me. The silence at this point was so absolute that my footsteps seemed amplified. When I reached the end of the hallway, I found a door ajar with a glimmer of light inside, just enough for the entrance. I stood in front of it, waiting for the customer to appear, but no one was visible. I sent another message, telling him I was there, waiting for him to give me some signal. Nothing. It was then when I heard a soft voice, like a whisper, from inside the room. It was saying my name. I felt a chill. I stood still, not understanding. I hadn't mentioned my name in the messages. I called out softly, "Excuse me, did you order the food?" But no one answered, just silence. The air in the hallway was freezing, and that open door seemed to be waiting for something from me. Something that, for no apparent reason, gave me an irrational fear. I felt the best thing was to leave the order on the floor and leave. I put it there, took a step back, but at that moment another message arrived. "Please come in, just for a moment." I don't know why, but something in me wanted to turn around and go down the stairs as fast as I could. I had gotten into strange situations before, but that one, there was something about that place that gave me a different kind of discomfort. I hesitated for a few seconds, but then I decided to get out of there. I started going down the stairs, and that's when I heard footsteps behind me. It was as if someone was following me. I didn't want to turn around. I quickened my pace, and the footsteps behind me did the same, getting closer and closer. I reached the first floor without even breathing, but there was no one when I dared to look back, just the echo of my own footsteps. I left the building, and at that moment I felt momentary relief. I was almost at the motorcycle when a strange sensation made me look up toward the fourth floor. There was a figure at the window, someone tall, without clear details. I stood there looking at him for a second, trying to make out his face, but it was as if something in the shadows covered it. Then slowly, that figure raised a hand and waved at me. It was something he did in a slow, unnatural way, as if saying goodbye to me. I got on the motorcycle and started it without even thinking about anything else. I just wanted to get out of there, but the trip back was just as strange. Despite being far away now, I felt like there was something behind me. That sensation that something is following you, as if somehow it was waiting for a moment to appear again. When I got to the restaurant and told my boss what happened, I thought he was going to laugh at me. But instead, he stayed quiet, listening, and when I finished, he looked at me and said quietly, "You're not the first one that happens to there." He told me that years ago, a frequent customer of that restaurant lived in that same building. He was an older, lonely man who always ordered the same food every night. One night, the neighbors heard him screaming, but when the police arrived, there was no one there anymore. No one saw him again since then. Delivery drivers who go to that address tell similar things. That night, I quit the job. It wasn't the first strange delivery I'd made, but it was the only one that made me feel like that. as if something had followed me from the building. I never passed by that street again or looked toward the fourth floor. And although months have passed since that night, I still wonder what would have happened if I had crossed that door, if I had entered the fourth floor to face whatever or whoever was waiting there. Good evening. I'm listening to you from Barcelona. I was never one to believe in strange things or ghost stories, but what happened to me one night changed my way of thinking a little. I work as a food delivery driver by bicycle, and at this point, I already have experience riding around the entire city, delivering to all kinds of people and places. But one night, an order left me with one of those sensations that don't leave you for a long time, like a bad premonition that stays stuck. It was a Tuesday, a normal day. I had been making deliveries all afternoon and was about to finish my shift. It was about 9:30 at night when I got one more order. The address was downtown, a couple of blocks from where I was, so I didn't hesitate to accept it. It was a house I didn't remember seeing before, but being so close, I thought it wouldn't be a big deal. The order was quite large, enough to suppose someone was preparing a meeting or something like that. Nothing out of the ordinary. However, there was a note on the order that said, "Leave the food at the door. No one will open." At first, I didn't pay attention to it. It wouldn't be the first time a customer asked to leave the order without contact. I arrived at the place in a few minutes. The street was quiet, and the house, although it was like any other in the neighborhood, had a somewhat darker appearance, as if it had gone years without maintenance. It was almost all dark except for a dim light in the back, visible from the gate. I approached the door and left the bags on the ground, as the note said. But just when I turned around to leave, something made me turn back toward the house. I don't know if it was a kind of curiosity or just a bad feeling. But when I looked toward the back of the hallway that led to the entrance, I saw a figure standing there, like the silhouette of a man. He was far away, and I couldn't see his face, but clearly someone was there, immobile, as if waiting or watching. I thought it would be the owner or someone who lived there, but if so, why hadn't he told me something? I stood watching for another second, but I felt something was wrong. I got on my bicycle and left quickly. The next day during my shift, I got a notice from the restaurant. The customer had called to complain that his order never arrived. I was sure I had left it at the door, but I decided to call the registered number to confirm. The strange thing was that the call never went through. It was as if the number no longer existed. I only heard an empty tone, as if the line were dead. That left me uneasy. To make sure there was no error, I decided to return to the place in my free time and see if anyone would answer me. I arrived at the house again and rang the doorbell several times, but no one opened. The door remained closed, and no matter how much I insisted, I got no response. I felt a little foolish for insisting so much. So in the end, I decided to move away and leave it alone. However, that night something in my head kept going back to the subject. I couldn't stop thinking about the silhouette I had seen the first time. For me, that had been something so clear, and at the same time so strange. I decided to talk to a couple of friends, and one of them, upon hearing my story, told me that house was famous for being abandoned. According to him, no one had lived there in years, and the last time someone had moved there was only to leave immediately. Apparently, several neighbors considered it a cursed house. That same week, I received another order for that same address. This time it was a small order, a couple of drinks and some food. I remembered what I had heard and wanted to refuse to make the delivery, but it was my job. I took the order and returned to that street. The house was in the same state, with the lights off and that stillness that put my nerves on edge. I left the bag with the food at the door, and when I turned to leave, I heard a slight sound, like a dry knock coming from inside. My heart started beating faster, and for a moment I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But suddenly, I heard something more, a slight whisper, as if someone was talking, barely audible. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached a little to try to hear better. I couldn't understand what it said, but the murmurs came from the back, as if several voices were mixing at the same time. I decided not to stay another second and left there, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. A couple of days later, I started investigating more about the house. There was no clear information about who the owner was, and some neighbors I talked to told me that sometimes they saw lights on and shadows moving inside the house, despite everyone saying it was abandoned according to them. From that night on, I never received orders from that address again, and that left me with more doubts. I started thinking that maybe someone had realized something wasn't right, or that the order had been made by someone who didn't want anyone else to find out. The worst came later. In one of my deliveries through that area, an older man called me from his window. He asked me if I was the same delivery driver who had left food at that house. When I answered yes, the man crossed himself and told me that a long time ago someone had found remains on that property, like sacrificed animals or things like that. Supposedly years ago, there were those who tried to perform rituals, and since then the house had been marked, as he said. When I told him about the figure I saw, he looked at me seriously and told me, "That house isn't empty. It has never been empty." Since then, every time I pass near that place, I'm invaded by a feeling of discomfort. Something stayed with me, like a mark or a bad premonition. I have no proof, but that night something or someone was there inside. Since then, I avoid passing nearby. I don't know if the order I delivered was for someone else, or if something was playing with me, but one thing is certain: I'll never forget that silhouette in the darkness. My name is Antonio. In the mid-'80s, when I was young and had just moved to Los Angeles, I got a job as a delivery driver at a pizzeria. It was the first time I lived away from my small hometown in a bigger place with tangled streets and neighborhoods I was barely getting used to. Smartphones and map apps didn't exist, so we guided ourselves with a paper map that the boss had lent me and with the directions that customers wrote down. There was always a detail or some reference, so we wouldn't get lost. That night around 9 p.m., a customer called to order a pizza and a soda. The order was for a place somewhat remote in an area I had never been to. The boss didn't seem to like it when they gave him the address, but since he was alone, he asked me to go. "Don't take long and come back quickly," he told me with a strange tone, almost as if he were giving me a warning. I left on the bicycle with the order well secured in the backpack. The trip was taking me longer than I expected. It was getting darker and more desolate. The road didn't have many houses around, just empty lots and trees swaying in the wind. With no more light than that from the street lamps on the highway, increasingly spaced apart. I looked at the map trying to orient myself, but with the lack of clear references, I was starting to feel lost. I stopped every so often trying to find some point that matched what I had written on the paper, but nothing. After going around a couple of times without finding anything, I came to a dirt path that seemed to lead to a house. I wasn't sure if I should continue, but I hoped someone there could give me directions. The house was about 20 meters away, surrounded by tall grass, and seemed to be in a lamentable state, walls with cracks, windows broken or covered by old boards, and the roof half collapsed. That's when I realized that maybe someone had given me the wrong address, or it was just a prank. Just when I was about to turn around, I heard a scream, a loud, clear scream of pure suffering that seemed to come from the house. I froze upon hearing such a horrible sound. I looked around thinking maybe someone had heard the same thing I did, but there was no one. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and that house that from afar seemed abandoned. Now, I knew something very bad was happening inside. I would have wanted to get out of there, but the need to help and some clumsiness made me decide to stay. Sometimes one acts on pure impulse, and that's what happened to me. I advanced a little, crouched toward a broken window through which I could see a glimmer of light inside. When I looked in, I found something I never thought I'd see in my life. Inside that house was a group of people dressed in red robes, all standing, surrounding a table. This wasn't just any table. It seemed more like an altar. On it was a person lying completely still, and around him, those hooded figures were murmuring something, a somber and choral chant, very disturbing. It wasn't Spanish or any language I recognized. The words seemed loaded with something cursed, and the tone in which they pronounced them was so macabre. The figure on the table had his face covered, and although I could barely see, I got the impression he was unconscious or worse, already lifeless. I was petrified when I realized those people weren't there by accident. They had everything prepared for what appeared to be horrible rituals I never imagined witnessing. From where I was, I could see metal objects and knives, as well as marks painted on the floor that looked like strange symbols, drawings that seemed to have been made with something dark and dry, as if they were bloodstains. My hands started trembling and my breathing quickened. I wanted to run away, but something made me keep looking. I could barely believe that was happening so close to me. Every second, I felt the situation becoming more dangerous. And suddenly, one of the hooded figures raised his head and directed his gaze toward the window toward me. I saw him clearly. His face was in shadows, but I noticed the gleam of his eyes, and I would swear he knew I was there. He looked at me, I said, as if he had felt my fear watching them. Without thinking twice, I ran away from there. I jumped from the window and got on the bicycle as I could, while I heard screams from those people wanting to come out to catch me. The way back was hell. I pedaled with all my strength, with my sight fixed ahead, not daring to look back. My legs hurt, but I didn't stop until I reached the restaurant where I worked. When I entered, I could barely speak. Words got stuck, and I was so altered that the boss approached to calm me down. I told him what I saw, the screams, the robes, the man on the table, everything. But his reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of being alarmed or willing to call the police, my boss looked at me in silence, as if he were deciding what to tell me. Then, without looking me in the eyes, he said, "It's better you don't talk about this, Antonio." Those things, it's best not to get involved, or we could have a very bad time. After hearing that, I didn't know what to respond. I looked at him without understanding, waiting for an explanation that never came. And in the end, I just left. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent it awake with the sound of those chants and the screams echoing in my head. I don't know how long I was there in bed trying to convince myself that everything had been a bad trick of my imagination, but I couldn't. That was real, and the worst thing was that it seemed like my boss knew something. The next day, I decided to quit. I couldn't go back to that place or to that bicycle I had used to get to that house. Since then, I stopped asking questions. I preferred to move forward and forget it, but there are things one never forgets. Many years have passed, but on nights when the silence becomes heavy, I remember that look from the window, those strange chants, and the face of that man that only emanated evil. Sometimes I wonder what became of that place, if someone else came to see the same thing I did, or if that house is still there, hidden, waiting for someone else to feel the same curiosity that led me to look through that window. The city has changed a lot since then, but I'll always have the doubt of what I saw that night, and why my boss seemed to know about it too. I never heard anything about the boss or the restaurant again, and until today, I've kept that experience in silence. My name is Joel, and I've been working as a delivery driver for 3 years now. You get used to the rough neighborhoods, the awkward hours, and the strange customers. You learn to push fear aside and just do your job. But there was one night about 2 months ago that I still can't quite wrap my head around. It was an experience that left me with an uneasiness I haven't been able to shake off. Something that now reminds me that sometimes you don't have all the answers. It was my last delivery of the night, well past midnight, and I was ready to head home. My shift was supposed to end at 11:30, but you know how it is in this business, orders keep coming in. I was already thinking about the leftover pizza in my fridge and maybe catching some late-night TV when another order popped up on my phone. Skip it, it's too late, I thought to myself. But for some reason, I accepted it anyway. Maybe it was the decent tip showing on the app, or maybe I was just running on autopilot. The address was in a part of town I didn't know very well. It was one of those areas that's off the beaten path from my usual routes, an old apartment complex on a street I rarely drove down. The building looked like it had seen better days, probably built sometime in the 70s and forgotten about ever since. When I pulled up in my Honda Civic, the first thing that struck me was how quiet everything was. It was one of those old brick buildings where you'd expect to hear air conditioners humming or TVs playing, but there was nothing, just dead silence. The building was completely dark except for a single yellow light at the entrance that flickered intermittently, casting these weird shadows on the cracked concrete steps. I grabbed my phone and sent a text to the customer to confirm the apartment number, like I always do. The response came back almost immediately. Just leave it at the building entrance and text me when you're done. I didn't think much of it at first. Plenty of customers prefer contactless delivery, especially late at night. Could be someone who doesn't want to wake up their roommates, or maybe they're dealing with their own stuff. I've learned not to ask questions in this job. I got out of my car, grabbed the bag of Chinese food from the passenger seat, and walked toward the entrance. The silence was even more pronounced now, not even the sound of traffic from the main road. Just as I was about to set the bag down by the door, my phone buzzed with another message. Actually, can you bring it to the 4th floor? End of the hallway. Sorry for the inconvenience. I stared at the message for a moment. The building didn't look like it had an elevator, which meant 4 flights of stairs with no guarantee of getting paid extra for the trouble. But something made me agree to it. Maybe I figured it was an elderly person or someone with mobility issues. I've had customers like that before. They tip well when you go the extra mile. I pushed through the heavy glass door and started climbing. The stairwell was dimly lit by those old fluorescent lights that buzz and flicker. With each flight, the silence seemed to get heavier, more oppressive. It was strange because old buildings like this usually have some kind of ambient noise, creaking floorboards, water running through pipes, muffled conversations from apartments, the hum of refrigerators. But here, there was absolutely nothing. Each floor I passed seemed more deserted than the last. When I finally reached the 4th floor, I found myself in a long, poorly lit hallway that stretched out in front of me like something from a horror movie. The carpet was worn and stained, and several of the ceiling lights were burned out, creating pockets of shadow between the working ones. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the absolute silence. At the far end of the hallway, I could see a door that was slightly ajar, with just a sliver of light coming from inside, barely enough to make out the doorframe. I stood in front of the door for a moment, expecting the customer to appear, but no one came. I pulled out my phone and sent another text. "I'm here with your order." No response. That's when I heard it, a voice, soft and barely above a whisper, coming from inside the apartment. It was saying my name. A chill ran down my spine. I froze, trying to process what I just heard. I hadn't mentioned my name in any of the messages. The app shows the restaurant's name and my first initial, but not my full first name. How could they know to call me Joel? "Excuse me," I called out softly. "Did you order Chinese food?" But there was no answer. Just that oppressive silence again. The air in the hallway felt cold suddenly, and that partially open door seemed to be waiting for something from me. Something that, for no logical reason, filled me with an irrational sense of dread. My instinct told me to just leave the food on the floor and get out of there. I set the bag down by the door and took a step back, but that's when my phone buzzed again. "Please come in, just for a moment." I don't know why, but every fiber of my being wanted to turn around and run down those stairs as fast as I could. I'd been in weird situations before, customers who answered the door in their underwear, people who were clearly high, apartments that smelled like they hadn't been cleaned in months. But this was different. There was something about this place that felt fundamentally wrong. I hesitated for several seconds, then decided I'd had enough. I started heading back toward the stairs, walking quickly but trying not to run. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. It sounded like someone was following me, matching my pace. I didn't want to look back, so I picked up speed, and the footsteps behind me did the same, getting closer and closer. I could hear them clearly now, the soft thud of shoes on carpet, staying just a few steps behind me. I made it to the first floor without even breathing properly. But when I finally worked up the courage to look back, there was no one there. Just the echo of my own footsteps and the empty stairwell stretching up into darkness. I pushed through the entrance door and felt a momentary wave of relief wash over me. I was almost to my car when some strange compulsion made me look up toward the fourth floor. There was a figure in one of the windows, tall, but I couldn't make out any clear details. I stood there for a second, trying to focus on the figure's face, but it was like something in the shadows was obscuring it. Then, slowly, deliberately, the figure raised one hand and waved at me. It was a slow, unnatural motion, like they were saying goodbye. I got in my car and drove away without thinking about anything else, except getting as far from that building as possible. But the drive home was just as unsettling. Even though I was miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. That sensation when you know something's behind you, waiting for the right moment to make itself known again. When I got back to the restaurant and told my manager what had happened, I expected him to laugh it off or tell me I was being paranoid. But instead, he went quiet and just listened. When I finished the story, he looked at me and said in a low voice, "You're not the first driver this has happened to." He told me that years ago, there was a regular customer who lived in that same building. An older man kept to himself, who ordered the same meal every night around the same time. One night, neighbors heard him screaming, but by the time the police arrived, there was no one there. No one ever saw him again. Since then, drivers who have gone to that address have reported similar experiences: voices calling their names, footsteps in empty hallways, figures in windows. I quit that job the next day. It wasn't the first strange delivery I'd ever made, but it was the only one that made me feel like something had followed me home from work. I never drove down that street again, never looked up at the fourth floor of any building if I could help it. Even though months have passed since that night, I still wonder what would have happened if I had walked through that door. If I had gone into that apartment to face whatever or whoever was waiting for me in the darkness. I'm calling in from Denver, Colorado. I never used to believe in paranormal stuff or ghost stories, but what happened to me one night changed the way I think about things. I work as a bike delivery driver for a local restaurant, and at this point, I've got plenty of experience riding around the city, delivering to all kinds of people and places. But one particular delivery left me with one of those feelings that sticks with you for a long time, like a bad premonition that just won't let go. It was a Thursday night in late October, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd been making deliveries all evening and was getting close to the end of my shift. It was around 9:45 when I got another order through the app. The address was downtown, just a couple of blocks from where I was, so I didn't hesitate to accept it. It was a house I didn't remember seeing before, but being so close to my location, I figured it would be a quick and easy delivery to cap off the night. The order was pretty substantial, enough food for what I assumed was a small party or family gathering. Nothing unusual about that, especially on a Thursday when people might be getting together to watch football or just hang out. There was a note attached to the order that said, "Leave food at front door, no one will answer." At first, I didn't give it much thought. Contactless delivery had become pretty standard, especially after the pandemic, and plenty of customers still preferred it that way. I made it to the location in about 8 minutes. The street was quiet, typical for that time of night in that neighborhood. The house, while similar to others in the area, had this oddly neglected appearance, like it had been sitting empty for years without any maintenance. Most of the windows were dark, except for one dim light visible from somewhere deep inside the house, barely noticeable from the front porch. I walked up to the front door and set the bags down on the doormat, just like the instructions said. But as I turned to head back to my bike, something made me pause and look back at the house. I'm not sure if it was curiosity or just a strange feeling, but when I looked toward the end of the front hallway that led to the interior, I saw the silhouette of a person standing there. It was clearly the outline of a man, standing motionless like he was watching or waiting for something. He was far enough back that I couldn't make out his face, but someone was definitely there. I thought it might be the homeowner or someone who lived there, but if that was the case, why hadn't they said anything to me? Why leave instructions to just drop the food and go if they were planning to watch from inside anyway? Something felt off about the whole situation. I stood there for another second or two, but the feeling that something was wrong kept growing stronger. I got on my bike and rode away quickly, telling myself I was probably just overthinking things. People are weird sometimes, and it wasn't my job to figure out why. The next day during my shift, I got a notification from the restaurant. The customer had called to complain that their order never arrived. I was certain I'd left it at the front door exactly as requested, but I decided to call the number on file to clarify what had happened. The weird thing was, the call never went through. It wasn't like the number was busy or went to voicemail. It was like the line was completely dead. Just this empty tone, like the number didn't exist anymore. That left me feeling uneasy. To make sure I hadn't made some kind of mistake, I decided to go back to the house during my break and see if anyone was home. I rode back to the address and knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. The door remained closed, and no matter how long I waited or how many times I knocked, I got no response. I felt a little foolish for being so persistent, so I eventually gave up and rode away. But that night, something about the whole situation kept nagging at me. I couldn't stop thinking about the silhouette I'd seen that first time. It had been so clear, so definite, yet so strange at the same time. I decided to talk to a couple of friends about it, and one of them, after hearing my story, told me that house had a reputation for being abandoned. According to him, no one had lived there in years, and the last time someone had tried to move in, they'd left almost immediately. Apparently, several neighbors considered it to be cursed or haunted. That same week, I received another order for the exact same address. This time it was a smaller order, just a couple of drinks and an appetizer. I remembered what my friend had told me and wanted to decline the delivery, but it was my job, and I needed the money. I took the order and rode back to that street, my stomach in knots the whole way. The house was in the same condition as before: dark windows, that single dim light somewhere in the back, and that unsettling quietness that seemed to surround the place. I left the bag with the food at the front door and turned to leave, but as I was walking away, I heard a sound from inside. It was a dull thud, like something heavy had been dropped or knocked over. My heart started beating faster, and for a moment, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard something else, a low murmuring, like someone was talking, barely audible through the walls. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved closer to try to hear better. I couldn't make out any words, but the murmuring seemed to be coming from deep inside the house, like multiple voices mixing together. It was like they were having a conversation, but the tone was somehow urgent, almost desperate. I decided not to stick around for another second and got out of there, feeling more uncomfortable than ever. The whole ride back to the restaurant, I kept looking over my shoulder like I expected to see someone following me. A couple of days later, I started doing some research about the house. There wasn't any clear information about who owned it, and some neighbors I talked to mentioned that they sometimes saw lights on and shadows moving inside, even though everyone agreed the place was supposed to be empty. After that night, I never received another order from that address, which left me with even more questions. I started thinking that maybe someone had realized something wasn't right, or that whoever had been placing the orders didn't want anyone else to find out what was going on. The worst part came later. During one of my deliveries in that neighborhood, an elderly man called to me from his window. He asked if I was the same delivery driver who had been leaving food at that house. When I said yes, the man crossed himself and told me that some time ago, someone had found remains on that property, animal bones, arranged in strange patterns, things like that. Supposedly, years back, people had tried to perform rituals there, and ever since then, the house had been marked, as he put it. When I told him about the figure I'd seen, he looked at me seriously and said, "That house isn't empty. It's never been empty." Since then, every time I pass near that place, I'm overcome with a feeling of uneasiness. Something stayed with me from those nights, like a mark or a bad omen. I don't have any proof, but I know that something or someone was in there. I've been avoiding that area ever since. I don't know if the orders I delivered were meant for someone living, or if something was playing games with me, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget that silhouette standing in the darkness, watching me from the depths of that cursed house. My name is Tony, and this happened back in the mid-'80s when I was young and had just moved to Portland, Oregon. I'd gotten a job as a delivery driver for a local pizza place, my first real job since leaving my small hometown for the big city. It was the first time I'd lived away from home, in a place with complicated streets and neighborhoods I was still getting used to. There were no smartphones or GPS apps back then, so we relied on a paper map that my boss had lent me. And customers always had to include detailed directions or landmarks so we wouldn't get lost. That particular night, around 9 o'clock, a customer called to order a large pizza and a 2-liter of Coke. The delivery was to a place way out in the suburbs, in an area I'd never been to before. My boss didn't seem too happy when he heard the address, but since I was the only driver working that night, he asked me to take it. "Don't take too long and get back here quick," he said in this weird tone, almost like he was giving me a warning. I left on my motorcycle with the order secured in my delivery bag. The ride was taking longer than I'd expected. The further I got from downtown, the darker and more isolated it became. There weren't many houses out there, just empty lots and tall pine trees swaying in the wind, with only the occasional streetlight to break up the darkness. I kept checking the hand-drawn map, trying to orient myself, but with the lack of clear landmarks, I was starting to feel lost. I had to stop every few minutes, trying to find something that matched what the customer had written down, but nothing seemed right. After driving around in circles for about 20 minutes, I came to a dirt road that seemed to lead toward a house. I wasn't sure if I should follow it, but I was hoping someone there could give me directions. The house was about 50 yards down the road, surrounded by tall grass and woods, and it looked like it was in terrible condition. The walls were cracked. Several windows were either broken or boarded up with old plywood, and part of the roof had collapsed. That's when I realized someone had probably given me the wrong address, or this was just some kind of prank. Just as I was about to turn around and head back, I heard a scream. It was loud and clear, a sound of pure agony that seemed to come from inside the house. I froze when I heard that horrible sound. I looked around, thinking maybe someone else had heard it too. But there was no one. I was alone in the middle of nowhere with this house that looked abandoned from the outside, but clearly had something terrible happening inside. I should have left right then and there, but the need to help someone, and honestly, just plain curiosity made me decide to stay. Sometimes you act on pure impulse, and that's what happened to me. I crept closer, crouching low as I approached a broken window, where I could see a flickering light coming from inside. When I looked through that window, I saw something I never thought I'd witness in my lifetime. Inside the house, there was a group of people wearing red robes, all standing in a circle around what looked like a makeshift altar. This wasn't just any table. It was clearly set up for some kind of ceremony. On top of it was a person lying completely still, and around the altar, these hooded figures were chanting something in unison, a dark and disturbing incantation. It wasn't English or any language I recognized. The words seemed loaded with something evil, and the tone they used was absolutely chilling. The figure on the altar had their face covered, and although I could barely make out details from where I was hiding, I got the impression that they were either unconscious or worse, already dead. I realized that these people weren't there by accident. They had everything prepared for what appeared to be some kind of horrific ritual that I never could have imagined witnessing. From my hiding spot, I could see metal objects and knives, plus markings painted on the floor that looked like strange symbols, drawings that seemed to have been made with something dark and dried, like bloodstains. My hands started shaking and my breathing became rapid. I wanted to run, but something kept me watching, barely able to believe that this was actually happening so close to me. With each passing second, I felt the situation becoming more dangerous. And suddenly, one of the hooded figures lifted their head and looked directly toward the window, directly at me. I saw him clearly. His face was mostly in shadow, but I caught the glint of his eyes, and I swear he knew I was there. He stared right at me, like he could sense my fear as I watched them perform their ritual. Without thinking twice, I ran from there as fast as I could. I jumped away from the window and got on my motorcycle while I could hear shouts from those people as they tried to come outside to catch me. The ride back was hell. I rode as fast as that old bike would go, my eyes fixed straight ahead, not daring to look back. My legs were cramping from gripping the bike so tightly, but I didn't stop until I reached the pizza place where I worked. When I got inside, I could barely speak. The words got stuck in my throat, and I was so shaken up that my boss came over to calm me down. I told him everything I'd seen, the screams, the robes, the person on the altar, all of it. But his reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of being alarmed or ready to call the police, my boss looked at me in silence, like he was deciding what to tell me. Then, without meeting my eyes, he said, "It's better if you don't talk about this, Tony. Those kinds of things." It's best not to get involved, or things could go very badly for us. After hearing that, I didn't know what to say. I looked at him, waiting for an explanation that never came, and finally I just left. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake with the sound of those chants and screams echoing in my head. I don't know how long I lay there in bed, trying to convince myself that it had all been some trick of my imagination. But I couldn't. What I'd seen was real, and the worst part was that my boss seemed to know something about it. The next day, I decided to quit. I couldn't go back to that place or get on that motorcycle that I'd used to reach that cursed house. Since then, I stopped asking questions. I preferred to move on and forget about it, but there are some things you never forget. Many years have passed, but on nights when the silence becomes heavy, I remember that stare from the window, those strange chants, and the face of that man that just radiated evil. Sometimes I wonder what became of that place, if anyone else ever saw what I saw, or if that house is still out there, hidden in the woods, waiting for someone else to feel the same curiosity that led me to look through that window. The city has changed a lot since then, but I'll always wonder what I saw that night and why my boss seemed to know about it too. I never found out what happened to him or the pizza place, and to this day, I've kept that experience to myself. My name is Oscar, and what I'm about to tell you is something that left me permanently shaken. It's the reason why, even though I still work as a delivery driver, I no longer accept orders to that building or any other place that reminds me even slightly of that location. It was a quiet night in downtown Seattle, one of those shifts where the delivery work becomes almost automatic. I remember I was nearly finished for the evening, just a few more orders before heading home. I was tired and ready to call it a day when I accepted what seemed like a simple delivery, just a few blocks from where I was. The order was for the Flores apartment building, an old construction right in the heart of the city that I'd driven past countless times, but never actually entered. I don't usually pay much attention to the aesthetics of buildings, but from the moment I walked through the front entrance, there was something about this place that felt off. The lobby lights flickered intermittently, and the hallways were filled with dampness and that smell of old things, accumulated neglect. The elevator was out of order, which meant I'd have to take the stairs to deliver to apartment 407. When I arrived at the building, there was already someone waiting for me in the lobby. It was an elderly man wearing dark glasses and clothes that seemed like they were from another era, maybe the 70s or 80s. His appearance was somewhat unusual, but I've learned not to judge anyone in this job. You encounter all types of people. He greeted me with a nervous smile and paid for his order, but just as I was handing over his food, he asked me for a favor. "Young man, could you take a package up to apartment 407? It's nothing complicated, and of course, I'll pay you a generous tip for the trouble." He showed me a small cardboard box, old and weathered, with no labels or anything to indicate what was inside. I hesitated for a moment, but the generous tip he offered convinced me. I accepted the task, and the man thanked me with a trembling voice. Then he gave me what would later stick in my memory as a warning. "Don't open the box, just leave it on the kitchen table and get out immediately." I climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. With each step, I felt heavier, and although the building seemed almost empty, there was an oppressive atmosphere on that floor, like the walls themselves were holding onto something dark. I reached 407 and immediately noticed a strong smell hit me as I approached the door. It wasn't just dampness, it was something metallic, like there was something old and rusted behind the door. I knocked a couple of times, but got no answer. I was about to leave the box on the floor when I heard a voice, low, muffled, asking me to come in. The door was slightly ajar, like someone had left it that way on purpose. I stood there paralyzed for a few seconds, but the desire to finish the job quickly won out. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was practically empty, just a few pieces of furniture covered in dust, and an old television that was turned on but showing no signal. The screen was pure static, and the soft sound of white noise echoed throughout the place, making me feel even more uncomfortable. I walked to the kitchen table to leave the box, and that's when the voice spoke again, warning me, "Don't look toward the bedroom." The tone of the voice had something desperate about it, almost pleading. I wanted to convince myself it was some kind of joke, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong here. I set the box on the table anyway and turned to leave as quickly as possible. As I walked toward the door, my eyes accidentally drifted to a small side table near the entrance. There was a framed photograph sitting there, and what I saw in it chilled me to the bone. It was the same elderly man who had met me in the lobby, but he was with a group of people who all had somber expressions, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, almost like the photo was from decades ago. Recognizing his face sent a shiver down my spine. His expression in the photo was different, almost vacant, empty. When I finally left the apartment, I practically ran down the stairs. I ran into the building's superintendent, a man in his 50s, who I'd exchanged a few words with before going upstairs. Not knowing quite what to say, I mentioned the strange encounter with the elderly man in the lobby and commented about apartment 407. The moment I mentioned that number, his expression changed dramatically. He looked at me seriously, with a mixture of warning and pity in his eyes. "Son, nobody has lived in 407 for years. The last tenant was an elderly man who died there some time ago, under strange circumstances. They found him 3 weeks after he'd passed, and the police report mentioned some pretty unusual details about the scene." I didn't know what to say. How could someone have died there if I'd just seen him in the lobby? I tried to process what the superintendent was telling me, but I couldn't make sense of it. I decided not to dwell on it too much. I'd completed the delivery and just wanted to get out of there. When I got home that night, still feeling unsettled, I decided to look up information about the building and apartment 407, more out of curiosity than anything else. That's when I found a news article from several years back about a fire in that apartment. It turns out that several people had died in that unit back in the 80s, and one of the victims was a man who perfectly matched the description of the customer who had asked me for the favor. According to the article, he was someone who kept to himself, rarely left his apartment, and often asked neighbors for small favors, like picking up packages or moving boxes. The article also mentioned that tenants and visitors to the building had reported strange occurrences in the years following the fire. Voices in empty apartments, elevators stopping on the 4th floor without being called, and people matching the descriptions of the fire victims being seen in the hallways. From that night on, whenever I think about the Flores building, I get this strange feeling, like there's still something unfinished there. That box I left on the table, the television playing static for no reason, and that black and white photograph, it all stayed burned into my memory. I decided never to go back there, but I know that somehow that place is still in my head, and I don't know if I'll ever stop wondering who the man really was who met me that night in the lobby. The strangest part is that about a month later, I was talking to another delivery driver who worked for a different company, and when I mentioned the florist building, he went pale. He told me he'd had a similar experience there. An elderly man in old clothes asking him to deliver something to the 4th floor, an apartment that was supposed to be empty, and that same feeling that something was watching him the entire time. I still drive past that building sometimes on my way to other deliveries, and I always make sure not to look up at the 4th floor windows. But sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I swear I can see that same figure standing there, waiting patiently for the next person curious enough to help him with just one small favor. Good things happen to me during the day, but when night falls, I feel like I don't deserve a single moment of happiness or joy. It's like a nightmare, a memory from the past that will never stop tormenting me. No matter how many therapy sessions I attend, or how many times I try to distract myself to forget it. In these words I write, I want to tell you how my nights stopped being peaceful. And most of the time I feel like the worst person in the world. It happened during a period of my life more than 2 decades ago, when I worked as a food delivery driver before apps like DoorDash or Uber Eats existed. A friend recommended me at this restaurant, since that was the only way they hired staff. The salary was ridiculously high, and the contract specifically stated that we couldn't reveal that amount. It was completely confidential information. Not following that rule would cause serious problems, even legal ones, especially after signing. I always wondered how it was possible that an ordinary restaurant, nothing extravagant about it, would assign delivery drivers a salary as if they were professional cooks or prestigious chefs. I had already received advice to keep my mouth shut, and I followed it perfectly, even among my coworkers. That's when they assigned me the order that would change my life forever. My own boss assigned it to me personally. He didn't send anyone else. He told me motivational words, claiming I was one of the best workers. I didn't understand why he was telling me that at that moment, but I must confess it felt good, and I went a bit more motivated to deliver the order. When I arrived, I realized the house was too luxurious. A mansion, in few words. I was admiring the residence before ringing the doorbell, which in the end I couldn't even do. Without realizing it, some people came from behind and put a cloth over my face that within seconds caused me to faint, unable to do anything to prevent it. I didn't know anything about myself until I woke up tied up in a dark room, illuminated only by candles. The walls were black, but I could make out symbols painted in red on them, pentagrams, and demonic shapes. I had an idea of where I was, and then a woman arrived escorted by men in black robes. She was the one who told me they were going to sacrifice me. They were a cult that worshipped the demon Abaddon, the angel of destruction. Moments before they acted with the knife, a woman appeared wearing a white robe, telling them that I couldn't be sacrificed because the initial of my name didn't correspond with what the demon wanted that month. But the solution of those wretches was to force me to call one of my coworkers to come to that house. I was completely terrified, but to save my life as best I could, I convinced him to go, assuring him of a good tip. Almost half an hour later he arrived, and I myself saw how they did the same thing to him that they did to me. They tied him to a chair while they untied me, but they let him see me. He knew, before dying, that the one who got him into this was me. I cried while they inflicted wounds on him that didn't kill him instantly, but left him agonizing. This wasn't a simple sacrifice, it was torture. They lasted an hour doing that, and he finally died from losing so much blood. They freed me after that, threatening me that they would do the same to my mother if I talked. Months later, I found out that the same cult was the one financing the restaurant I worked for, and my boss was a member of them. We immediately moved without giving notice to my job, and fortunately to this day, I never heard anything again about my boss or that cult. Those monsters will always be in my nightmares. A home delivery made me realize that in the world there are many mysteries that man still hasn't discovered, or that he discovered and found a way to keep them secret. Whatever the reason, until today I hadn't dared to tell anyone anything, for fear that they would think I was going crazy or that I had lost my mind. I'm from Texas, and this happened when I worked as a delivery driver at a fast food restaurant in Austin. I got along well with everyone, especially with my female manager, who gave me a good portion of the tips at the end of the day, and with whom I had intimate relations in secret without anyone finding out. Sometimes we were the last ones to stay at the restaurant, and we'd do it in the kitchen. Other times we'd leave early, and she'd use the excuse that she was going to give me a ride just because it was on her way, and she liked to drive. I never knew if some coworkers noticed this and out of fear of being fired didn't say anything, but I didn't care. She was very pretty and had a good body. She brightened my nights just by seeing her and the flirtatious way she spoke to me. Despite all that, one night put an end not only to that secret romance, but to my job at that restaurant. They had assigned me an order like any other. They gave me a paper with the address and the name of the person who ordered it. The thing is, on my way to that place, I received a call from a man who claimed to know me, and he told me he was going to give me a large amount of money if I didn't deliver the food I was carrying in my bag where I was supposed to, but where he told me so he could eat it himself. I told him he could easily help by calling the restaurant to have them prepare something new and have it delivered in the shortest time possible. But he insisted no, saying it would be faster if it was the one I was carrying, and then he mentioned the money again. That convinced me and I said yes, so he gave me the address and I changed my route, heading to where he told me. I planned to give a portion to my manager so I wouldn't have problems, but that would be later. I don't know why, but I remember that as I was arriving, I started to feel strange. I felt a bad premonition, and on more than 2 occasions, I almost lost my balance on the motorcycle and fell. I was lucky the streets were empty at that hour, or I would have had a serious accident. I arrived where that man told me, but it was a parking lot. At first I didn't see anyone. I tried to call him, and then I heard the phone ring. I followed the sound, walking slowly. By the way it seemed to be hidden, in my mind only passed the idea that maybe the one who called me was having intimate relations behind some car or inside one. but it wasn't like that. I looked and peered between two pickup trucks, and then I saw the scene that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A lifeless body was on the ground, with the cell phone ringing beside it. But on top of it was a man, apparently a man, but with black fur all over his body, and with an abnormal length of his torso, behaving like an animal, and covered in blood from that poor man he had just killed. I was frozen, and without realizing it, I let out a stifled sigh that he managed to hear. That man raised his head and looked at me with those savage eyes, but lifeless, as if he felt no emotions. He didn't look like a man in disguise. It was something more, that kind of creature from the legends told in small towns, like those stories of skinwalkers or other supernatural beings. Regaining control of my body, I backed away slowly, trying not to make noise even though he had already seen me. That thing growled, but didn't move from its position over the inert body. I turned around and headed toward my motorcycle, trying not to panic. The engine started, and I immediately accelerated, getting away from that parking lot with my heart beating 1,000 times per hour. While heading back to the restaurant, I tried to calm down and think about what I should do. I couldn't go back there as if nothing had happened. I had to tell someone, but who? The police, my manager, who would believe me? I decided the best thing was to talk to my manager. She had always been understanding with me, and maybe she could help me find a solution. When I got to the restaurant, she was already closing. Her expression turned to concern when she saw me so upset. I told her everything from the man's call, which I deduced had been that thing speaking at that moment, to the creature in the parking lot. Her eyes widened with each word, but she didn't interrupt me. We went together to the police station and told the story. The officers seemed skeptical, but the seriousness in our voice and the coherence in the details convinced them that at least they should investigate. The next day, the local news talked about a murder in a parking lot, but they didn't mention anything about the creature I saw. I wondered if the authorities decided to keep that part secret to avoid panic, or maybe they knew something I didn't. During the following days, I felt watched, as if someone was monitoring me. Weeks passed, and my life seemed to return to normal. I had taken a few days off, but returned to work at the same restaurant, trying to forget what happened. One night while closing the restaurant, my manager approached me, but not in the way she used to before, but as if she wanted to tell me something, and indeed, this is what she told me. The creature you saw isn't the only one. There are more of them. My uncle belongs to a secret society that hides among us. They are sorcerers, or as many know them, shapeshifters. Some can be peaceful, but there are others like the one you saw that can be very dangerous. You can't say anything about what you saw because you could be in great danger by wanting to make your sighting public. I was stunned, unable to process what she was telling me. I didn't know what to do or say. I was left speechless, and I only told her I had to go. The next day, I received a message from her telling me not to show up to work anymore, that it was for the best. And I never heard from her again. Since that day, I live with the certainty that the world is much more mysterious and dangerous than I ever imagined. Maybe no one will believe my experience, but I know what I saw. A unique night made me think that sometimes people ignore mental health, believing it's not important. And this leads to the development of such perverse minds that they end up transforming people into deranged psychopaths, capable of committing tragedies that they end up enjoying. That's the thought that night I'll never forget left me with. It seemed like a day like any other. I had barely been working for a few days with the DoorDash app, recommended by some friends who were doing more than well with it, and that encouraged me to join. I felt comfortable. The commissions and tips were well paid. I couldn't complain. That money helped a lot at home, since I couldn't be admitted to any university due to poor performance on admission exams. My parents were more than upset, but working helped me a lot. On weekends in the morning, I studied, taking a computer science course. My father had a contact who said that when I finished, he could get me a good job at the company he worked for, and it was good motivation without a doubt. It was one night when the notification for a new order arrived, which I accepted immediately, and then went to the restaurant to pick it up. While I was waiting, they told me there that apparently the app had been having problems, since the address had changed more than twice. But the same person who ordered it confirmed it, so everything was in order, and they expected the error with the address wouldn't happen again. They gave me the order, and I started the route to the place. Just as that man at the restaurant told me, the address changed on 3 different occasions, and in the end, I got disoriented. I couldn't go from one side to another, so I decided to call the person who ordered it, and a girl answered who confirmed a new address for me, and I went there. I arrived at the house and approached the door to knock. That's when I was shocked to see that the girl who came out had all her clothes covered in red stains. It was evident what they belonged to. I was about to run, but suddenly she pulled out a gun hidden behind her back, which left me completely immobile. She looked at me with a cold stare, but at the same time smiling, telling me to come in. And if I refused, she was going to empty the entire clip without thinking twice. In her gaze, I saw the certainty she had, and I convinced myself she wasn't lying to me. She was telling the truth, and underestimating her would have cost me my life. I couldn't risk running and receiving shots in the back, dying in such a horrible way, so I entered and she closed the door. She took me to the living room, where I saw another scene equally or more disturbing than at the entrance. A young man was lying on the floor, bathed in a pool of blood. She told me it was her boyfriend. My body was trembling, but I didn't want to show her fear. I felt that if I did, then I would be in more danger, and the next one to lose his life would be me. She took me to the table, and I saw an Ouija board on it. This woman told me that she convinced him to play, but that by doing this, they opened the door to a demon that communicated with them. And this demon forced her to commit such a tragedy. In a moment of lucidity, it seemed she managed to overcome the demon to speak on her own account. She seemed not to understand well what was happening, but she screamed at me to call the police. Then she took out her phone, called the police and gave her name, her boyfriend's name, the address of the house, and what had happened that night. Before hanging up, she told them I was innocent of everything, and then she did it. She took her own life with the weapon. I started screaming uncontrollably until the police arrived and removed me from the place. After investigating everything and checking the house's cameras, they confirmed I had nothing to do with it and let me go. We should never put ourselves in danger with situations we don't understand, but above all, with dark and diabolical subjects. This happened in 2004. I remember when I started studying at university in Denver. I was running a bit short on money for everything that was required of me, not to mention transportation costs and the times I had to eat there. So I decided to start working as a food delivery driver for a restaurant in the northern part of the city. My name is Leo, and I'm sharing my story from Colorado. The truth is, I was doing well at that job. The salary was modest, but my boss knew my situation and helped me with something extra. However, a special, different, and unique delivery made me experience what I consider today one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, which I wouldn't want to repeat for anything in the world. It was a normal night. I had just arrived since I had to take midterm exams. I had spent the whole week studying, and I felt nervous because all my classmates kept saying that professor was one of the worst, that he could easily make us fail the subject if he felt like it. I must confess I felt I prepared more than enough, and I answered the questions with great confidence. That motivated me at work, and my boss noticed it. That night I had to make about 4 deliveries, when he told me to stop making deliveries. In fact, he proposed that I take a break, because soon a special delivery would come out that he was saving just for me. I asked him for details about it, but he refused to give them to me. In my mind only passed the idea of a good tip, and it was what I could expect if it was as special as he told me. Finally, the moment came. He called me on the phone and told me to come to the parking lot in the back with the restaurant bag, where he put the food I would carry. I did so, and I saw him with a bag where the order was. He gave it to me, gave me the address, and told me to be very careful, not to do anything out of the ordinary and limit myself to making the delivery to return as quickly as possible. Before leaving, he told me that what I was going to see, I couldn't mention to anyone for anything in the world, and that the moment I left the house, the best thing was to forget it, and not even tell him about it. Everything was weird, but when he told me how much they were going to give me as a tip, things changed. It was very good money, and I wasn't going to refuse it, not even as a joke, so I prepared the order in the bag and headed toward the address my boss gave me. I kept thinking that delivery was very different from all the ones I had made since I started working with him. There was something strange about all of that, but I decided not to rack my brain thinking about it. I finally arrived at the house, and I got a big surprise. It was curiously very far from the others, secluded. The lights were off, giving the impression that there was no one inside. However, the house numbers were the same as noted on the paper my boss gave me, so it had to be there. I got off the motorcycle and went up the steps that led to the door. It looked like a ruined, abandoned dwelling. It felt a bit creepy being there, but that was my job. I knocked on the door once, and no one came out. But on the second knock, it opened by itself. And from inside, I heard a voice telling me to come in and put the order on the table, that the money and the good tip I was promised were right there. I had no complaints about that, especially when I realized it was a woman's voice. Only the place smelled very bad, but with that pay, it was what mattered least to me. The lights from outside allowed me to see the table, but when I entered the house, some candles lit up that gave me a clearer view of the place. I concentrated so much on the table that I didn't turn to look elsewhere. I put the food there and grabbed the money without even counting it because it was a lot. But I immediately divided what I had to return to my boss from the tip. When I turned my gaze to the rest of the living room, I was shocked by what I saw. I didn't know whether to call her a woman or a deformity. Her skin was excessively full of wrinkles, few strands of hair between her skull and coming out of her armpits. She was completely naked, and her posture was very hunched. She walked without needing a cane, although she seemed to need one. But there was something even worse next to her. An altar full of human and animal parts. Some were just bones, and others already rotting with a disgusting smell. I was paralyzed, unable to speak, trembling, and with my mind blank. I didn't make a single sound. It was that thing that spoke and smiled, apparently happy that she already had the package, and with coldness she simply told me to leave. Seeing so many human parts made me think that if she was capable of accumulating so many bodies there, then I could also end up there if I did something that disturbed her. So the best thing was to leave while I still had the opportunity. I did so, and when I got far enough away, I took out my phone to call the police. I told them everything I knew, and they told me not to move from there, that a patrol would arrive soon. I waited, I don't know how long, it could have been very little. But for me, it was eternal, until I saw a car approaching from the corner. But I got a big surprise when it approached, and I saw it was my boss. He got out of the car quickly and snatched my phone, telling me not to make that mistake again, to forget what I saw and return to the restaurant acting as if nothing had happened. He liked me, but I could have a very bad time if I said something. I didn't understand what had just happened. Apparently the police were in collusion with this situation, but I didn't want to get more involved in the matter. I deduced that if I kept investigating, I was going to have a bad time, so I had no other choice. I arrived at the restaurant, and after about half an hour my boss arrived, and we acted as if nothing happened. The only thing I can deduce is that my boss asked that witch for jobs to ensure the success of his restaurant, just like the police. Only they would know why they were involved in this macabre situation. Maybe they also asked for protection, or something darker. 2 weeks later, I quit. My name is Andre Galvan, and I've lived in Texas my entire life. Back in 2012, I was working as a delivery driver for a popular burger chain that you'd probably recognize. My shift ran from 3 in the afternoon until 11 at night, Monday through Saturday. When you're driving to dozens of houses every day, you see all kinds of things and meet all sorts of people, some friendly, some not so much. But I'd never experienced anything supernatural during my deliveries until that particular evening. It was a Tuesday night, and I was making what should have been a routine delivery. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the suburban neighborhood, but there was still enough daylight to see clearly. I pulled up to a modest, single-story house with a well-maintained front yard and honked my horn to announce my arrival, as was customary. I grabbed the order from my delivery bag and walked up to the front gate, a wrought iron barrier that gave me a clear view into the front yard. That's when I heard the sound of children playing, specifically, a little girl's voice chattering away animatedly. I looked toward the right side of the yard and saw exactly what I expected. A girl of about 6 or 7 years old sitting, cross-legged on the grass with her back to me. But what caught my attention were her playmates. Sitting directly across from her were 2 boys who appeared to be around the same age. They were identical twins, dressed in matching red t-shirts and blue jeans. Even their haircuts were identical, perfect bowl cuts that made them look like mirror images of each other. They were playing with what looked like toy cars and action figures scattered on a small blanket. At first, Everything seemed perfectly normal. Just kids playing in their yard on a pleasant evening. The little girl was talking to the boys, though I couldn't make out what she was saying from where I stood. But then something changed. The twins noticed me standing there, and both of their heads turned in my direction simultaneously, moving in perfect unison like they were controlled by the same mind. The moment their eyes met mine, I felt an uncomfortable chill run down my spine. They stopped playing immediately. No more smiles, no more interaction with the girl who continued chattering away, oblivious to the change in atmosphere. They just sat there, perfectly still, staring at me with an intensity that seemed far too mature for children their age. Their eyes were dark, almost black in the fading light, and there was something cold about their gaze, something that made my skin crawl. I've worked with the public long enough to be comfortable around all kinds of people, but these two boys made me feel genuinely unsettled. It wasn't just that they were staring. It was the way they were staring, like they were studying me, calculating something. I tried to shake off the feeling and stepped back a few feet, positioning myself behind a larger section of the fence where they couldn't see me and I couldn't see them. I hoped that breaking eye contact would help me feel more at ease. The little girl continued her animated conversation, seemingly unaware that her playmates were no longer participating. After waiting a few more minutes with no sign of the customer, I honked my horn again. This time, the front door opened almost immediately, and a woman in her 30s emerged, looking slightly frazzled. She had shoulder-length brown hair and was wearing a floral apron over her clothes. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," she called out as she hurried toward the gate. "Have you been waiting long? I was in the kitchen and didn't hear you arrive." I assured her it was no problem, and that I hadn't been waiting too long. As she approached to take the food, I noticed her glance toward where her daughter was still sitting on the grass. "Sweetie, why didn't you tell me the delivery man was here?" she asked her daughter gently. The little girl looked up innocently. "I didn't know he was here, Mommy. I was playing with Tommy and Jimmy." She gestured toward the spot where I had seen the twin boys, but when I looked over, there was nothing there but empty grass and scattered toys. I felt my stomach drop. The boys had vanished completely, leaving no trace they had ever been there. I looked around the yard, thinking maybe they had moved to another area or gone inside, but there was nowhere for them to have gone so quickly and quietly. "I'm sorry," I said to the woman, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I thought I saw your daughter playing with two other children when I arrived. Twin boys. They were sitting right there with her." The woman's expression changed instantly. The color drained from her face, and she looked at me with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "I'm sorry, what did you say? Twin boys?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, they looked like they were about the same age as your daughter. Identical twins wearing matching red shirts. They were playing together when I got here, but they seemed to notice me watching them." The woman stared at me for a long moment, then looked at her daughter, who had gone back to arranging her toys as if nothing unusual had happened. "Sir, I don't have any other children," she said slowly. "Emma is my only child, and there are no children that age in this neighborhood. The closest would be the Henderson kids 3 blocks over, and they're teenagers." I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. But I saw them clearly. They were sitting right there, playing with her. When they noticed me, they both stopped and just stared at me. It was like they knew I could see them. The woman's hands were shaking slightly as she took the food from me. "Emma has always talked about her imaginary friends," she said quietly, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. "Tommy and Jimmy, she calls them. They've been her constant companions since she was 3 years old. My husband and I always thought it was normal, you know. Lots of kids have imaginary friends." She paused, looking at her daughter, who was now having an animated conversation with seemingly empty air. "But you're saying you could see them too?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The woman looked terrified now, and I was starting to feel the same way. Those boys I had seen, if they weren't real children, then what were they? And why had they been able to see me seeing them, the way they looked at me? I said quietly. It wasn't the way children usually look at strangers. There was something, knowing about it, something that didn't feel right. The woman clutched the food bag tighter. "What should I do?" she whispered. "If they're not imaginary, if they're actually something else, what does that mean for Emma?" I didn't have an answer for her. I wished I could offer some comfort or explanation, but I was just as shaken as she was. All I knew was that what I had witnessed didn't feel benevolent. Those twins, whatever they were, had radiated something cold and calculating. "Maybe you should talk to someone," I suggested gently. "Someone who knows about these kinds of things, and maybe keep a closer eye on Emma when she's playing outside." The woman nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Thank you for telling me. I know this must sound crazy, but I believe you. There have been times when I've felt like someone was watching me in the house, or I'd hear Emma talking to someone when I knew she was alone, and her responses seemed too mature for a child's imagination." She called Emma inside, and I watched as the little girl gathered her toys, still chattering to her invisible companions. As they disappeared into the house, I heard Emma say, "Bye, Tommy. Bye, Jimmy. See you tomorrow." I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual, glancing frequently in my rearview mirror. The image of those two boys, their synchronized movements, their cold stares, their sudden disappearance, remained burned in my memory. That was 15 years ago, and I still think about that delivery sometimes. I wonder what happened to Emma and her mother, whether they ever found answers or help. I wonder if Tommy and Jimmy were truly harmless imaginary friends that I somehow managed to see, or if they were something else entirely, something that had attached itself to a lonely little girl who just wanted someone to play with. What I know for certain is that there are things in this world that exist just beyond the edge of our normal perception. And sometimes, for reasons we can't understand, that edge shifts just enough for us to glimpse what lies on the other side. I just hope that little girl was safe from whatever I saw that day. My name is Maximiliano, but everyone calls me Max. I'm a medical student now, just months away from finishing my degree, but several years ago when I was first starting college, I worked part-time as a pizza delivery driver to help pay for my studies. I would deliver pizzas in the evenings and weekends while attending classes during the day. I only lasted about 4 months in that job, and what I'm about to tell you is exactly why I quit. It was a cold February night in 2015. I was 19 years old at the time, working the evening shift for a local pizza place called Mario's in downtown Portland, Oregon. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid decent money for a college student, and the flexible hours worked well with my class schedule. That particular night, I remember checking the clock on the wall repeatedly. It was getting close to 10:30, and I was hoping to finish early so I could get home and study for an anatomy exam I had the next morning. I was just thinking about packing up when the phone rang, and my manager told me I had one last delivery to make. The address was in a residential area about 20 minutes away from the restaurant, in a neighborhood I'd delivered to many times before. It was an older part of town, with tree-lined streets and houses that had been built in the 1940s and 50s. Most of the homes were well-maintained, with neat lawns and flower gardens, even in winter. I loaded the pizza into my insulated delivery bag, grabbed my keys, and headed out into the cold night air. The temperature had dropped significantly since the afternoon, and I could see my breath forming small clouds as I walked to my car. Streets were mostly empty, which was typical for a weeknight in that area. When I arrived at the address, I was struck by how beautiful the house was. It was a classic two-story Victorian with intricate woodwork and a wraparound porch. Even in the darkness, I could see that the front yard was meticulously maintained, with carefully pruned rose bushes and a small garden area that would probably be stunning in the spring. I parked in the driveway and grabbed the pizza. The porch light was on, which was always a good sign. It meant the customer was expecting me and ready to complete the transaction quickly. I walked up the front steps and rang the doorbell. After a moment, I heard a man's voice from inside the house. "Come on in," he called out. The doors unlocked. This struck me as a bit unusual. Most customers came to the door to receive their food, especially late at night. But it wasn't unheard of, particularly with elderly customers or people who might have mobility issues. I assumed the man was probably just busy in the kitchen or watching something on television. I turned the handle and stepped into the foyer. The house was dimly lit, with just a few lamps casting a warm glow throughout the front room. I could smell the lingering aroma of what seemed like a home-cooked meal, something with herbs and garlic. "Hello," I called out. "Pizza delivery." "Just give me a minute," came the reply from somewhere deeper in the house. "I'll be right there." I stood in the entryway, holding the pizza box and looking around. The interior of the house was just as impressive as the exterior. Antique furniture, family photographs on the walls, and shelves lined with books and decorative items. Everything was neat and tidy, giving the impression of someone who took great pride in their home. But as minutes passed, I began to feel uneasy. The house was too quiet. I couldn't hear any movement from the back rooms, no footsteps, no sounds of someone looking for their wallet or counting out money. Just silence. I checked my watch. I'd been standing there for almost 5 minutes, which was unusual. Most customers were eager to get their food while it was still hot. "Excuse me," I called out a bit louder. "Your pizza is here." Still no response. I was starting to get impatient. I had studying to do, and the longer I stood there, the later I would get home. I decided to be more assertive. I walked a few steps toward the back of the house and called out again. "Sir, your pizza has arrived." That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The silence wasn't just unusual, it was absolute. There was no sound of breathing, no subtle noises that living people make even when they're trying to be quiet. The house felt empty, but not in the way an empty house usually feels. It felt dead. I was about to turn around and leave when I heard a scratching sound near my feet. I looked down and saw that there was a small pet door cut into the bottom of the front door, the kind that allows cats or small dogs to come and go as they please. The scratching continued, and then I saw something that made me drop the pizza box and stumble backward. A hand emerged from the pet door, but this wasn't a normal hand. It was pale, not just pale, but the color of old ivory, with a bluish tint around the fingernails. The skin was puffy and bloated, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. In my anatomy classes, I had studied enough about decomposition to recognize exactly what I was looking at. This was the hand of a dead person. Clutched in the swollen fingers was a $20 bill. The exact amount needed to pay for the pizza, plus a reasonable tip. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place, staring at this grotesque scene. The hand remained extended through the pet door, the money fluttering slightly in the cold air that was seeping in from outside. I finally broke free from my paralysis and ran. I didn't care about the pizza I'd dropped, didn't care about anything except getting out of that house and as far away as possible. I burst through the front door, practically fell down the porch steps, and threw myself into my car. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. I drove back to the restaurant faster than I'd ever driven before, my mind racing with questions and horrible possibilities. When I burst through the restaurant's back door, my manager took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. "What happened?" he asked. I could barely speak, but I managed to explain what I had seen. My manager's expression grew more serious with each detail I shared. "Are you sure about what you saw?" he asked when I finished. I nodded, still shaking. "I'm studying medicine. I know what a dead body looks like." Without hesitation, my manager called the police. He explained the situation to the dispatcher, and within minutes, 2 patrol cars were heading to the address. I waited at the restaurant, drinking coffee and trying to calm my nerves. About an hour later, one of the officers called to speak with my manager. The conversation was brief, but I could tell from my manager's expression that the news wasn't good. When he hung up, he looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "They found her," he said quietly. "An elderly woman named Margaret Thompson. She'd been dead for at least 2 days, maybe longer. They found her cat dead too, probably from starvation." I felt sick to my stomach. But who put the money in her hand? "Who told me to come in?" My manager shook his head. "They don't know. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else being in the house. The pizza box you dropped was still on the floor where you left it, but the money was gone. The police never found who was responsible. The case was investigated as a possible homicide, but no suspects were ever identified. Margaret Thompson had lived alone with her cat, and according to neighbors, she rarely had visitors. She was a retired librarian who kept to herself, though everyone agreed she was a kind and gentle person. What haunted me most was the realization that someone had been in that house with Margaret's body. Someone had heard me at the door, had spoken to me in a normal voice, and had carefully placed money in a dead woman's hand to push through the pet door. The psychological profile of someone who would do something like that was deeply disturbing. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to make another delivery, knowing that something like that could happen again. The incident affected me so deeply that I had to take a leave of absence from school to deal with the trauma. But in a strange way, the experience also reinforced my commitment to medicine. I realized that I wanted to help people, to be someone who could potentially prevent tragedies like what happened to Margaret Thompson. I wanted to understand death so that I could better serve the living. It's been several years now, and I'm about to graduate from medical school. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm working late in the hospital and the corridors are quiet and empty. I think about Margaret Thompson, alone in her house with her cat, and I wonder if she knew what was coming. I think about the person who violated her death for their own twisted entertainment, and I hope they were eventually caught for other crimes. Most of all, I think about how thin the line is between the normal world we think we know and the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface. That night taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it sounds like a normal voice calling through a door, asking you to come inside. My name is Edgar, and I'm 35 years old now, but I want to tell you about something that happened to me when I was 23 and working as a pizza delivery driver in San Diego, California. The pizzeria I worked for stayed open until 2 in the morning because we were located near the Gaslamp Quarter, where all the bars and nightclubs were concentrated. We got a lot of business from people who wanted food after a night out. I actually enjoyed working the late shift. There was something peaceful about driving through the city in the early morning hours when traffic was light and most of the world was asleep. The tips were usually better too, since people tended to be more generous after they'd been drinking. It was a Saturday night in March of 2008, and I was working with my coworker Danny, who handled the register and took phone orders while I did the deliveries. We were having a slow night, just a few orders here and there from the usual late-night crowd. At exactly midnight, the phone rang. Danny picked it up and took down the information for what seemed like a straightforward order: one large pepperoni pizza to be delivered to an address in Hillcrest, a residential neighborhood about 15 minutes away from our location. "You've got to run," Danny told me, hanging up the phone. Guy sounded a little weird, but the address checked out. The pizza came out of the oven quickly, and I loaded it into my delivery bag. The drive to Hillcrest was pleasant. The neighborhood had tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes, most of them built in the 1920s and 30s. It was the kind of area where young professionals and small families lived, generally safe and quiet. But when I arrived at the address, something was immediately wrong. The house looked like it had been abandoned for months. The lawn was overgrown with weeds. Newspapers and flyers were scattered across the front porch, and several windows had boards nailed over them. The paint was peeling, and there were clear signs of neglect everywhere I looked. I double-checked the address on my receipt. This was definitely the right place, but it was obvious that nobody lived here. I sat in my car for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe someone had given us a fake address as a prank, or maybe I had written down the wrong information. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The house had a long, narrow driveway that led to what had probably once been a carport, but there was no gate or barrier preventing access. As I walked closer, I could see that the property was in even worse condition than it had appeared from the street. There was trash scattered around the driveway, and I caught a whiff of something unpleasant, the smell of decay and neglect that accumulates in places where no one has lived for a long time. I was about to turn around and leave when I heard a voice from inside the house. "Come in," called a man's voice. It was muffled by the walls, but clear enough to understand. I stopped and looked at the front door. It was closed, and like everything else about the property, it looked like it hadn't been opened in ages. "Excuse me," I called back. "I have your pizza delivery." "Just come inside," the voice replied, a bit louder this time. I took a few steps closer to the house, but everything about the situation felt wrong. The voice had sounded strange, not just muffled, but somehow hollow, like it was coming from a great distance. I was debating whether to go to the door when I heard someone behind me. "I wouldn't go in there if I were you." I turned around to see an elderly woman standing at the edge of the property. She was probably in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and wearing a worn coat despite the mild weather. She had 3 dogs with her, mixed breeds that looked like they might be strays she had taken in. "Excuse me," I said. "That house," she said, pointing at the building behind me. "Nobody lives there. Hasn't been anyone in there for over a year." I looked back at the house, then at the woman. "Someone just called for a pizza delivery. I heard a voice from inside just now." The woman shook her head firmly. "The man who used to live there died last spring. Heart attack right there in the living room. Nobody found him for 3 days." As she spoke, I noticed that her dogs were acting strangely. They were whimpering and backing away from the house, their tails tucked between their legs. One of them, a small terrier mix, was actually trembling. "What was he like?" I asked. "The man who lived here." The woman's expression darkened. "Harold Brennan. He was troubled, always bringing home different young men, sometimes very young. Neighbors complained about loud noises, strange smells coming from the house. Police were called a few times, but nothing ever came of it." She paused, looking at the boarded-up windows. "After he died, his family came to clean out the house. They found things that made them sell the property immediately and move away. Nobody's wanted to buy it since then." I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of things? The kind of things that suggest Harold wasn't just eccentric, she said quietly. The kind of things that make you wonder about those young men who visited and were never seen again. Her dogs were becoming more agitated, pulling at their leashes and trying to move away from the property. The terrier had started making a low whining sound. My dogs won't even walk past this place anymore, the woman continued. Animals can sense things we can't, you know. They know when a place has been contaminated. I looked back at the house and called out, "Hello. Is anyone in there?" For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard the voice again, but this time it sounded different, deeper, more menacing. "Come inside, boy. Don't keep me waiting." Woman grabbed my arm. "Don't you dare go in there," she said urgently. "Whatever you heard, it's not human. That place, it's not right. It hasn't been right since Harold died, and maybe not even before then." I didn't need any more convincing. The combination of the woman's story, the dog's behavior, and the increasingly disturbing voice from the house was enough to make me want to get as far away as possible. I thanked the woman and hurried back to my car, leaving the pizza behind. As I drove away, I could see her in my rearview mirror, standing with her dogs and watching to make sure I actually left. When I got back to the restaurant, Danny asked why I still had the pizza. The house was abandoned, I told him. Completely empty, has been for over a year. Danny looked confused. But someone called from that number. The caller ID showed that address. I explained what the woman had told me about Harold Brennan and what I had experienced at the house. Danny was skeptical about the supernatural elements, but he agreed that the situation was too dangerous to ignore. "Probably someone trying to lure you into an isolated location," he said. "Good thing you didn't go inside." But 3 days later, when I came back to work after my day off, Danny had a different perspective on what had happened. "That house called again," he told me as soon as I arrived. "What do you mean, called again?" "Same number, same address. This time I made Jerry take the delivery." Jerry was another driver who had started working there recently. "I told him about what happened to you, but the manager was here and insisted someone had to go." "What happened?" Danny's face was pale. Jerry came back about an hour later, completely freaked out. He said he went to the front door and knocked, and heard someone telling him to come inside. When he refused, the door opened by itself. I felt my stomach drop. Did he go in? No, but he said he felt something grab his arm and try to pull him through the doorway. He couldn't see what it was, just felt this incredible cold and this pressure on his arm. He managed to break free and run back to his car. "Did you call the police?" The manager did, after Jerry showed us the bruises on his arm. 5-finger marks, clear as day. The cops went to check it out, but they said the house was empty. No signs of anyone being inside, no evidence of forced entry or any kind of disturbance. Over the next several weeks, the phone calls continued. Always at exactly midnight, always the same voice ordering a pizza to be delivered to Harold Brennan's abandoned house. We stopped responding to them, but they kept coming, sometimes every night for a week, then stopping for a few days before starting up again. The phone company confirmed that the calls were indeed coming from that address, even though there was no active phone service to the property. The police investigated, but found no explanation for how the calls were being made. Eventually, the calls stopped as suddenly as they had started. We never found out why, or what had been causing them. House was eventually demolished about 2 years later, and a new family built a modern home on the lot. As far as I know, they've never had any problems, but I still think about Harold Brennan sometimes, and about whatever was making those phone calls from his empty house. I think about the young men the neighbor mentioned and wonder what really happened to them. Most of all, I think about how close I came to walking through that front door and what might have been waiting for me inside. That experience taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, no matter how normal it might seem on the surface. Sometimes the most dangerous situations are the ones that appear routine until it's too late to turn back. My name is Gilberto, and even though this happened several years ago, the memory of that terrifying night still haunts me. I was living in Phoenix, Arizona at the time, working as a delivery driver for a Chinese restaurant called Golden Dragon. My shift typically ended around 11 at night, since the restaurant stopped taking delivery orders at that time and closed at midnight. This particular incident occurred in July of 2014, during one of Phoenix's notorious heat waves, when temperatures stayed above 90 degrees, even late at night. I remember the oppressive heat because it made everything that happened seem even more surreal and unsettling. On this night, I received an order to deliver to a new housing development on the outskirts of the city, in an area that was still being built out. The development was called Desert Vista Estates, and it was one of those planned communities that promised luxury living, but was still mostly empty lots and half-finished construction. The order was unusually large, 4 complete dinner combinations with extra rice and several appetizers. It was enough food for a small party, which wasn't uncommon for weekend orders. But this was a Tuesday night around 10:30, which struck me as odd timing for entertaining. As I drove into Desert Vista Estates, I was immediately struck by how isolated and underdeveloped the area was. Most of the lots were still empty, marked only by wooden stakes and surveyors' flags. The few houses that had been built were in various stages of completion. Some with just the foundation poured, others with walls up but no roof, and a handful that looked nearly finished but obviously unoccupied. The streetlights were sparse, and many weren't working yet, leaving large stretches of road in darkness. My GPS kept recalculating the route, because many of the planned streets didn't actually exist yet, existing only on maps and development plans. When I finally found the correct address, I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the house in disbelief. It was a large 2-story home that appeared to be nearly complete from the outside, but something was clearly off about it. The windows on the first floor had glass, but the second-story windows were just empty frames. The exterior walls were covered with house wrap, but hadn't been painted yet, giving the building a ghostly, unfinished appearance. There were no other occupied houses visible in any direction. The nearest completed home was at least 3 blocks away, and I couldn't see any lights or signs of life anywhere in the development. I was about to drive away, assuming this was some kind of prank call, when the front door opened. A man stepped out onto the unfinished porch. He was wearing what appeared to be a realistic dog mask, the kind you might see at a high-end costume shop, not a cheap Halloween decoration. It covered his entire head and looked disturbingly lifelike, with detailed fur texture and frighteningly realistic eyes and teeth. The sight of someone in a mask answering the door in the middle of July, in an abandoned housing development, immediately set off every alarm bell in my head. But the man waved at me in a friendly manner, and called out that he was the one who had ordered the food. "Sorry about the mask," he said, his voice slightly muffled. "We're having a themed dinner party. Hope that's not too weird for you." I reluctantly got out of my car and approached the house, carrying the large order in 2 bags. As I got closer, I could see warm light flickering from inside the house, candle light, which made sense if the electricity hadn't been connected yet. "Just wait here," the man in the dog mask said. "I need to get my wallet." He disappeared back into the house, leaving the front door open. That's when I got a clear view of the interior, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. There was a long folding table set up in what would have been the living room, surrounded by at least 8 people. Every single one of them was wearing an elaborate animal mask. I could see a pig, a horse, a cat, several different bird masks, and what looked like a wolf or fox. The masks were all extremely detailed and realistic, but there was something deeply unsettling about them in the flickering candlelight. The table was set with paper plates and plastic cups, and there were several bottles of wine and what looked like beer bottles scattered around. But it was the atmosphere that was most disturbing. Everyone was sitting perfectly still, not talking or moving, just waiting. When they noticed me looking through the doorway, several of them turned their masked faces toward me. Even though I couldn't see their real faces, I could feel their attention like a physical weight. There was something predatory about their stillness, like a pack of animals studying potential prey. One of them, the person wearing the pig mask, stood up and walked toward the door. As he got closer, I could see that the mask was even more disturbing up close, with realistic snout and small, dark eyes that seemed to follow my movement. "Why don't you come inside?" the pig-masked figure asked in a voice that was definitely male, but strangely distorted by the mask. "We're just getting started with dinner. You look like you could use a break from the heat." I took several steps backward, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. The whole scene felt like something out of a nightmare: the isolated location, the unfinished house, the group of masked figures sitting in candlelight around a table in an empty room. "No, thank you," I managed to say. "I just need to deliver the food and get back to work." The pig-masked man tilted his head to one side like a curious animal. "Are you sure? We ordered plenty of food, more than enough to share." That's when I heard laughter from upstairs. The original man in the dog mask had appeared at one of the empty window frames on the 2nd floor. He was looking down at me and laughing in a way that sounded completely unhinged, like someone who had lost all connection to reality. "Don't be shy," he called down to me. "Come join our little gathering. We've been waiting for someone like you." The way he said, "someone like you," made my skin crawl. I looked back at the group around the table, and now more of them had stood up and were moving toward the open doorway. They moved in an oddly coordinated way, like they had rehearsed this scenario before. The person in the horse mask was holding what looked like a rope, and another figure wearing a bird mask had produced a large kitchen knife from somewhere. The candlelight reflected off the blade, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I dropped the bags of food and ran. Behind me, I heard them start to laugh, not normal laughter, but the kind of sound people make when they're completely detached from normal human behavior. It was the laughter of people who enjoyed causing fear and pain, who found genuine amusement in terrorizing others. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. As I finally managed to get inside and start the engine, I could see them in my rearview mirror. Several of the masked figures had come out of the house and were standing in the driveway, watching me. They made no attempt to chase my car, but I could see them clearly in the glow of my taillights. They just stood there, perfectly still again, like mannequins arranged in a tableau. The sight of those animal masks staring after me was somehow more terrifying than if they had actually pursued me. I drove straight back to the restaurant, well over the speed limit, checking my mirrors constantly to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I burst through the back door, my manager took one look at my face and asked what had happened. I tried to explain, but it sounded insane even to me. A group of people in animal masks, sitting around a table in an unfinished house, trying to lure me inside with promises of food and conversation. It sounded like the plot of a bad horror movie. My manager was skeptical but concerned enough to call the police, especially when I mentioned the knife and rope I had seen. 2 officers were dispatched to check out the location, but when they arrived at the house about an hour later, they found it completely empty. According to their report, there was no furniture, no table, no candles, no evidence that anyone had been there recently. The house was just an empty shell with concrete floors and unfinished walls. There were no footprints in the dust, no signs of recent activity. The only thing they found was the bags of Chinese food I had dropped, sitting on the front porch where I had left them. Probably just some kids trying to scare you, one of the officers told my manager over the phone. These new developments are popular with teenagers looking for places to hang out and cause trouble. But I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't teenagers playing pranks. The people in that house had been adults, and there had been something deeply wrong with the entire situation. The way they moved, the way they spoke, the coordinated nature of their behavior. It all suggested something much more organized and dangerous than a group of kids looking for thrills. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to make any more deliveries, especially to isolated locations. The incident had shaken me so deeply that I had trouble sleeping for weeks afterward. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see those animal masks staring at me in the candlelight. I ended up moving to a different city about 6 months later, partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that I might encounter those people again. Phoenix is a big city, but the thought that they were out there somewhere, possibly planning similar encounters with other unsuspecting victims, made me too anxious to stay. I never found out who they were or what they were really planning to do if I had been foolish enough to enter that house. I don't want to know. What I do know is that there are people in this world who derive pleasure from creating fear and confusion, who enjoy putting others in dangerous situations just to see how they'll react. The masks were particularly disturbing because they dehumanized the wearers completely. I couldn't see their faces, couldn't gauge their emotions or intentions from their expressions. They became something other than human, something predatory and alien. I've often wondered if I was their first target, or if there had been others before me who weren't as lucky or as quick to recognize the danger. I've thought about other delivery drivers, repair technicians, or anyone else whose job might take them to isolated locations where they could be vulnerable to this kind of ambush. Sometimes I search online for news stories about missing persons or unsolved crimes in the Phoenix area around that time, looking for any indication that my experience was connected to something larger. I've never found anything conclusive, but that doesn't make me feel any better about it. What haunts me most is the realization of how close I came to walking into that house. If I had been a little less cautious, a little more trusting, or simply more focused on completing the delivery and getting my tip, I might have stepped through that doorway. And I'm certain that if I had, I would never have walked back out. The experience taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself obviously. Sometimes it wears masks, literal or metaphorical, and speaks in friendly voices, offering hospitality and companionship. Sometimes the most dangerous situations are the ones that seem almost normal, until you notice the small details that reveal the true nature of what you're facing. I still work in customer service, but I've never taken another delivery job. I can't bring myself to go to strangers' houses alone, especially in isolated areas. That night in the unfinished house changed my perspective on human nature and reminded me that there are people in the world who are capable of truly monstrous behavior, hidden behind masks, both literal and figurative. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.